How my belief system became a death cult. Part 1. The Death Cult Marketplace. 1 Playground of shadows, childhood innocence shredded by pixel idols, 2 Algorithms of arousal. Capital, data, and the sale of the soul, 3 Thanatos for clicks. When pleasure fuses with apocalypse. Part 2. The Shattered Logos, 4 War of Narratives. Words as weapons in the elite's Babel. 5. Contradiction is strength, doublespeak and manufactured confusion. The hunger of the people, consuming ourselves to death. Part 3. Mammon's engine. 7 The creature's lair, private cartels and the currency of chains. 8 Debt. As sacrament, how money magic feeds eternal servitude. 9 Roman peace, modern empire. Elite stability through controlled collapse. Part 4 Mind in exile. 10 Spiritual homelessness, wandering the edges of Xanadu. 11 Tears of granite. Isolation, resentment, and the will to power. 12 Mirrors of pornography, little deaths, and the echo of self-loathing. Part 5. A dichotomy of flames. 13. The Annihilator's prayer, crying for help while yearning to burn the world. 14 Babylon. Reforged, war, myth, and the fantasy of absolute cleansing. 15 Divine blindness, acting without foresight, calling it inspiration. Part 6 Thresholds and parallel doors. 16. Is there an elsewhere? Quantum dreams and the lure of alternate timelines. 17 Leaving without dying, reimagining flight, surrender, and return. 18 Towards an uncertain dawn. Can hate exhaust itself into hope? Part 1. The Death Cult. Marketplace. Chapter 1. Playground of shadows, childhood innocence shredded by pixel idols. The room was dark, save for the blue glow of the screen. I remember the silence, not because it was peaceful but because it was loud. The kind of silence that screams beneath your skin. I was 11. The world had already begun to peel away its mask. I do not blame the screen entirely. The screen was merely the mirror. What stared back was the grotesque face of the world that made it. Pixel idols, two-dimensional gods of lust, pain, and submission, flickered before my eyes. Their moans, their perfected flesh, their orchestrated degradation, all of it wired into my developing nervous system before I even knew what consent meant, before I understood the shape of my own boundaries. The first sacrament of the death cult is stolen innocence, wrote one of the nameless philosophers whose words I found later, buried between the static of propaganda and broken faith. That sacrament was mine. In how pornography and sex became a death cult, the thesis is clear. Sex has been stripped of transcendence and repackaged as product. The body, once temple, now billboard. The soul, once mystery, now data point. And I, like millions of others, was baptized in that marketplace before I understood its price. The algorithms did not care for age, only engagement. And engage I did, wide-eyed, alone, ashamed. What should have been a playground became a hunting ground. Innocence bled quietly, pixel by pixel. Chapter 2. Algorithms of arousal. Capital, data, and the sale of the soul. What is a soul worth? In the dystopia they engineered, the answer is measurable. Traffic, clicks, conversions. The creature from Jekyll Island revealed the dark genius of centralized capital, the creation of money from nothing, the orchestration of scarcity, the quiet chains of debt. But money, they learned, was not enough. To truly enslave, they needed something more intimate. They needed the human spirit itself. Thus came the algorithms. A machine does not lust, but it recognizes patterns. It learned the shape of our longing, the contours of our shame. It mapped desire like territory, and the maps were sold to the highest bidder. I watched as my own desires were hijacked. What I thought was pleasure was only conditioning. They fed me arousal like a ration, precise and engineered. Each click refined their dominion over my neural pathways. In corruption of the faithful, the church collapses not because God dies, but because the faithful trade mystery for marketplace, worship for dopamine. Pornography, social media, curated outrage, all threads of the same tapestry. A tapestry woven not by artisans, but by technocrats and profiteers who learned that control of the body begins with control of the screen. To sell the soul, you only need to convince the soul it is for sale. Chapter 3. Thanatos for clicks. When pleasure fuses with apocalypse, there is no climax, only escalation. The algorithm demands it. Pleasure was never enough. The little death, the orgasm, mutated into a metaphor for the greater death we race toward. We click, we consume, we degrade, we destroy. Not because we are free, but because we are programmed to. Freud named it thanatos, the death drive, the compulsion to return to dust. The architects of our digital prisons understood this instinct. They fused it with commerce. Pornography is no longer simply sex. It is warfare. It is the public ritual of spiritual annihilation, broadcast in HD, monetized in real time. Each view, each subscription, each whispered shameful confession fuels the engines of control. In this, I find both horror and a perverse comfort. My suffering, at least, is not anomalous. It is designed. The isolation I feel, the alienation, the rage, it is the product, not the defect. And the elite? They are not gods, merely engineers. Their tools, finance, surveillance, dopamine, degradation, their endgame, a docile race, shackled not by chains, but by addiction to our own destruction. I have seen the future they offer. It smells of sex, death, and silicon. And I reject it. But rejection is not escape. I remain here in the death cult marketplace, wandering the neon ruins, soul half-sold, heart still howling for exile, or for the fire that will end it all. The Shattered Logos. Part 2. Chapter 4. War of Narratives. Words as weapons in the elite's babble. I live in an age of babble. Each morning's news feels like stepping into a tower of cacophony, countless voices speaking different truths, none comprehensible to the others. Once upon a time, language strove to reflect reality. Now it is twisted to create reality. In this modern babble, words have become weapons, not to illuminate, but to obscure. Every utterance is calibrated for impact rather than insight. Meaning itself shifts like sand under the weight of endless interpretation, molded and remolded by those in power. We have entered a war of narratives where truth is no longer a discovery but a battleground, and the battle is waged with rhetoric and symbols instead of swords. In this war, victory does not belong to the factually correct or the righteous. It belongs to those who control perception. This war of narratives is the elite's babble, a deliberate confusion of tongues to divide and rule. Orwellian turns of phrase, from alternative facts to propaganda. Slogans deliberately muddy the waters of reality. Politicians and pundits speak in riddles and contradictions that fragment our shared understanding. We are inundated by information, yet starved for meaning. Like the builders of Babel in ancient myth, society finds its language confounded, but this time by design, not by any god. He who defines the words defines the world. The powerful know that the power to name is the power to rule. Labels are crafted as instruments of dominion. One idea can be haloed as justice while the same idea from another mouth is condemned as heresy. A man is no longer a man. He is a deplorable or a hero or a threat, depending on the story that must be told. Competing factions christen every act as virtue or vice to suit their needs. Our reality splinters into competing fictions, each demanding allegiance, each insisting it is the one true faith. There is no longer a shared world, only tribes speaking past each other in incompatible dialects of ideology. The elites cultivate this confusion because it cements their power. In the post-truth babble of today, people float between cynicism and credulity. As one analyst observed, we are caught between the extremes of newspeak and a digital babble, on one hand, deliberate simplification and lies on the other, an overload of dubious information such that truth and falsehood coexist in endless cacophony. Either way, the result is the same: ordinary citizens drowning in disinformation, unable to discern reality. A late philosopher, Hannah Arendt, warned of this outcome. If everybody always lies to you, Arendt noted, the consequence is not that you believe the lies, but that nobody believes anything any longer. A people that know longer can believe anything cannot make up its mind. It is deprived of its capacity to think and to judge, and with such a people you can then do what you please. In a society of constant lies and narrative manipulation, people eventually lose the very ability to recognize truth. Cynicism and confusion become the norm, and a confused, disoriented public is malleable. In this elite-crafted babble, we are so battered by contradictory stories that we give up on truth altogether. We slide into what one author calls the shattered logos, where language no longer reliably connects to reality. Promises and facts alike are unmoored, everything is in flux. Society drifts in manufactured confusion, a state in which those in power can continually rewrite the narrative to serve their needs. I have felt this confusion in my own soul. At times I've caught myself believing two opposite headlines in the same day, simply because each was presented with such certainty. In the evening, I questioned my own memory. Was anything true, or have I imagined it all? This mental vertigo is not a side effect of the system, it is the very goal. The new order thrives on our disorientation. Divide et impera, divide and rule, not by physical walls, but by mental ones. If we cannot agree on what is real, we cannot unite to resist those who profit from the chaos. Public debate decays into a tribal contest of narratives rather than a search for solutions. Every issue becomes a referendum on identity and loyalty instead of truth. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the powerful consolidate control, unchallenged by a populace too busy fighting phantoms and false enemies. And so the war of narratives rages on without end. It is a war within our minds and for our minds. Its front lines run through every social media feed, every newsroom, every classroom, every conversation at the dinner table. It breeds a culture of immediate reaction and perpetual outrage, leaving no room for reflection or doubt. In this war, words are carefully chosen to obscure or provoke rather than clarify, and truth is not discovered but assigned. Each day's truth is whatever the elites decree it is today. By tomorrow, reality may shift again beneath our feet. Yesterday's hero is today's villain. Yesterday's justice is today's oppression. What was true this morning is false by nightfall. Coherence is not required, only obedience to the narrative of the moment. Thus the ground is ever shifting, and we, the people, race madly to keep balance on the quicksand of propaganda. Yet in rare moments of stillness, I hear a whisper, a yearning for something solid, a logos unshattered. Perhaps it is my faith or memory of a more rational past, telling me that this state of babble is neither natural nor inevitable. For now, though, the whisper is drowned out by the clamor of battling truths. The result of this war of narratives is perpetual struggle. We are trapped in constant conflict between illusory realities, never pausing long enough to ask who benefits from our confusion. The masters of this babble know that a people who cannot find truth will settle for power. Exhausted by uncertainty, many will simply choose the narrative that speaks loudest or promises the most comfort. And that narrative will invariably be the one sanctioned by the elites. In the end, the war of narratives ensures no one outside the tower of power can ever marshal enough shared truth to topple those within it. This is the genius of the new tyranny. No need to burn books when the words in them have already been rendered meaningless. Chapter 5. Contradiction is strength, doublespeak, and manufactured confusion. They once taught me that contradiction is a flaw, something to be resolved. Now I am told implicitly that contradiction is a sign of sophistication, even of strength. I watch leaders claim peace while waging war, preach unity while sowing division, celebrate freedom in the same breath they tighten controls. In this dystopian theater, contradiction itself becomes the stabilizing constant. The very incoherence of official messaging is a strategy, a psychological weapon aimed at wearing down our resistance. I remember reading 1984 in school and shuddering at the party slogans, "War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength." It felt like absurd fiction. Yet here I stand in a reality where doublespeak rules the day. Governments tout draconian surveillance measures as safety and censorship as protective truth. Corporations say their exploitive practices are empowering or sustainable. In this world, language is inverted with a straight face. Words mean their opposite. George Orwell dramatized the insight that whoever controls language can control reality, or at least people's perception of it. Today we witness that drama live. Authorities communicate in doublespeak and contradiction so much that the public is driven into a state of learned helplessness. When every statement from on high has a counterstatement, when every policy is wrapped in euphemism, citizens eventually throw up their hands. Who knows what's true? We stop trying to figure things out and instead default to following whichever authority's voice seems loudest or most official. The tactic is insidious. When someone in power subjects you to impossible, conflicting demands, you are trapped. Psychologists call this a double bind. Gregory Bateson described, for example, a parent who says "I love you" while coldly shunning the child. a conflict between word and action that impairs the child's ability to reason or resist. The deliberate use of double-bind scenarios can be used as a form of thought control, leaving the victim in an impossible puzzle of confusion, fear, and powerlessness. Now, scale this up to society. We citizens are the child. The elite institutions are the parent. One arm of the regime tells us to be yourself, while another demands we conform to ever-shifting social codes. We are told all cultures are equal, yet also that our own culture is uniquely evil and must be reformed. We hear that we must speak up to show moral courage, yet if we say the wrong thing, we are castigated for it. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. The result is a low-grade, ever-present confusion, a sense that no matter what we think or say, it might be wrong. And that confusion is then weaponized to shame us. If you're confused, it's your fault. Educate yourself. Ultimately, most people surrender. We silence our questions and go along with whatever narrative is presented today, because hesitating, struggling to reconcile the contradictions, only brings ridicule or exclusion. Thus, contradiction breeds submission. It induces a kind of paralysis of the mind, an anxiety that seeks relief. By design, that relief comes by yielding to the latest decree from above. In a perverse inversion of logic, the very lack of coherence in the system forces people to cling to the next official truth as their only lifeline. As an analysis of this phenomenon describes, the confusion keeps people reliant on whatever official interpretation comes last. We become like devotees awaiting the oracle's next pronouncement. Only when Big Brother or Big Media speaks do we know what to believe, at least until the next reversal. Power presents itself as the sole beacon in a storm of chaos that it created. It is an age-old magician's trick: create distraction with one hand, and perform the sleight of hand with the other. The modern state first creates the problem confusion, and then offers itself as the solution clarification, thus tightening its grip while appearing benevolent. I have felt that grip. When the pandemic came, we were told to fear our neighbors yet also to stand together. The rules changed by the week. One moment masks were useless, the next they were mandatory. A treatment was dangerous misinformation, until suddenly it became recommended. To ask logical questions was to mark oneself as a troublemaker. I recall voicing a mild concern and immediately being attacked for not understanding the science, only to find the sanctioned explanation had changed a month later, aligning with what I had hesitated over. It was not an apology I received, but silence. By then, a new distraction had stolen everyone's attention. In hindsight, I see the pattern. Keep the public off balance, and they will gratefully grasp the hand that guides them, even if it was the same hand that pushed them over. The structure of this psychological warfare is coming into focus. Living in constant contradiction tends to induce anxiety and compliance. Studies in social psychology demonstrate that a confused individual often seeks authority for direction. Indeed, the confusion itself is wielded as proof that we need more guidance, usually from the very institutions generating the contradictions. The cycle feeds itself. Contradiction, confusion, surrender, rinse and repeat. Over time, people slowly cease searching for coherence at all. Why bother when every value or fact can invert tomorrow? In this way, contradiction becomes strength, not the strength of the people, but the strength of the ruling narrative. A populace that no longer trusts its own judgment can only be led. Even our intellectuals sometimes celebrate this state. They speak of embracing paradox and complexity, which has merit up to a point. Reality is complex. But too often this becomes an excuse for moral and intellectual surrender. It's easier to say truth is relative, nothing is certain, and let those with power decide what to do, than to fight for a consistent principle. The cynical atmosphere of postmodernity encourages us to treat everything as a joke or a game. Meanwhile, concrete policies and laws, very real in their effects, are enacted behind the smokescreen of ambiguity. Critically, this regime of contradictions is not merely an accidental byproduct of modern life. It is actively manufactured confusion. It serves an agenda of control. When language no longer has fixed meaning, when words like democracy, justice, or truth can mean whatever the elite want them to mean on a given day, the populace becomes easily steered. The regime can flip the script overnight and face minimal resistance. After all, who can protest objectively when objectivity itself is cast into doubt? We have, in effect, handed the keys of reality to those in power. As soon as one narrative loses effectiveness, another can be deployed. and the very memory of the old narrative fades in the collective haze. In Orwell's novel, the Ministry of Truth would simply rewrite yesterday's history to align with today's pronouncements. Today we accomplish something similar, not by physically altering records, but by overloading the public with contradicting narratives until memory and truth blur. If the logos, the principle of reason and meaning, is shattered, then whoever holds the biggest shard rules the game. Society, as one commentary put it, drifts in manufactured confusion, a state where power can continually reinvent the narrative to serve its needs. Indeed, confusion is a kind of raw material from which authority molds whatever shape it desires. In this state, ignorance truly becomes strength. Not the strength of unity as Orwell's party cynically claimed, but the strength of the regime over an ignorant people. Our ignorance, our disorientation, is their strength. Yet amidst this darkness, I seek signs of resistance. Is there a way to break the spell of doublespeak? Education helps, if it teaches the young to recognize logical fallacies and historical patterns. Remembering Orwell's lesson is a start. Vigilance over language is vigilance over freedom. I tell myself that each time I catch a contradiction being used to herd me along, I pause, I write down both opposing statements. I stare at them until the illusion breaks. It is not easy, the pressure to conform, to resolve the cognitive dissonance by simply accepting the party line, is immense. But the future of any free mind depends on resisting the ultimatum that 2 + 2 must equal 5 when commanded. We must reclaim the strength that comes not from contradiction and confusion, but from clarity and truth. Otherwise, we march smiling into bondage, applauding the beautiful contradictions that chain us. Chapter 6. The hunger of the people, consuming ourselves to death. When a society is starved of truth, it will consume anything to fill the void. I have seen this with my own eyes. In the absence of genuine meaning, we devour shallow substitutes. The modern citizen is like a starving person at an endless buffet, piling their plate with junk that cannot nourish. The masses are not given meaning. They are given hunger, a deep, insatiable need for purpose, identity, belonging. No matter how much we consume, the ache never ends. We consume ideology and find it hollow. We consume outrage and remain unsatisfied. We consume products and still feel empty. In the end, in our desperation, we consume each other. Society turns cannibalistic, one soul feeding on another, in an orgy of anger and tribalism. This engineered hunger is the engine of the entire system. An economy built on endless growth requires endless craving. A politics built on mass mobilization requires mass discontent. A population that is fed will rest. A population that is starving will obey. And so the populace is kept spiritually and psychologically famished, always grasping for the next thing that might satiate, always desperate enough to do as they're told. This is the theology of the masses, a perverse new faith. Its doctrine demands hunger rather than fulfillment. Its sacred command is not be at peace, but keep struggling, keep consuming. It does not ask us to discover what is true, only to believe what we are told today. In this pseudo-religion, salvation never comes. There is no promised land, only the mirage that dances on the horizon, urging us onward to the next purchase, the next crusade, the next indulgence. We have, in effect, replaced the sacred with the sale. Where once people sought redemption in prayer or community, now they seek it in the marketplace and the media stream. A smartphone screen becomes a tabernacle, a political rally, a tent revival of collective rage, a shopping mall, a cathedral of consumption. The old gods are gone, and new idols crowd the altar: celebrity, status, lust, novelty, power. Like the Israelites of old melting their gold to cast a golden calf, we too have forged an idol, a gleaming hollow calf of consumerism, before which the nation dances in frenzied devotion. And like the biblical idolaters, we are devouring ourselves from within. Our very worship consumes our substance. This is not poetic exaggeration, it is measurable reality. We gorge on empty pleasures and grow ever more malnourished in spirit. Studies confirm that the saturation of modern life in cheap gratification leaves people spiritually and emotionally hollow. For example, among young adults who use online pornography daily, nearly 1/3 report feeling depressed or hopeless most of the time, far more than their peers who consume little or none Psychologists note that constant sexual stimulation without deeper connection creates a kind of spiritual hangover. The psyche, starved of genuine affection and meaning, is left more anxious, lonely, and lost. In the broader sense, all our compulsive consumptions, food, drugs, entertainment, social media likes, follow this same pattern. They promise satisfaction but deliver emptiness and addiction. Hypersexualized consumer culture, for instance, teaches that sex is a transaction and thrill, not a bond, treating human bodies like objects. This dehumanizing consumption dulls the soul and disconnects desire from love or community. It is a feast that starves us the more we partake. Why then do we continue? Because our hunger, our emptiness, has been weaponized by those in power. They have learned to manufacture desire and exploit fear with precision. Every advertisement whispers that we lack something, and that buying their product will fill the gap. Every political message stokes some grievance, and that supporting the movement will quench it. But the cup is leaky, the satisfaction never lasts. The system makes profit and gains power not by fulfilling our needs, but by perpetuating them. The masses are infected, not with hunger for truth, but with hunger for consumption, desperate to consume, yet never satisfied. This hunger is not natural, it is designed, manufactured by those who benefit from chaos. Indeed, a populace of addicts, whether addicted to goods, media, or ideologies, is easily herded. Keep them chasing the next high, and they won't notice the walls of their prison being built around them. Keep them angry at each other, and they won't unite to challenge their real tormentors. Sometimes the hunger turns dark and outward. There is a profound observation in psychological literature. Modern hedonism, far from quenching our deeper thirst, often feeds a subconscious death drive, an apocalyptic longing to see it all burn. The satiated emptiness after indulgence can curdle into a desire for destruction. We see signs of this everywhere. A nihilistic current runs beneath both the culture of decadent pleasure and the culture of fanatical zealotry. They seem opposite, but they converge in thanatos, the death instinct. Hypersexual fantasy and violent ideology alike offer a fevered escape from meaninglessness, one through orgiastic indulgence, the other through righteous annihilation. It is no coincidence that some disaffected youths oscillate between binging on consumer pleasures and flirting with extremist movements. In both, there lies the seed of self-destruction. One analysis of contemporary culture notes how even secular movements adopt an eschatological end-times mentality, dreaming of a purging fire to usher in a utopia. Burn it all down becomes a rallying cry, a hope that from the ashes, a new pure world will emerge. And so, from the numb void of consumerist emptiness, some come to long for a grand obliteration to feel something. The elites, in turn, are happy to direct that longing as it suits them, into culture wars, into actual wars, into whatever revolution of perpetual unrest that keeps the masses from ever finding stability or enlightenment. If peace or satisfaction ever truly bloomed among the people, the elite's entire machinery of profit and power would grind to a halt. There can be no stability, no satisfaction, because a satisfied population no longer needs the faith, or the product, or the party. If one enemy or crisis is defeated, a new enemy must be invented. The hunger must be maintained at all costs. In this way, even our pleasures have been turned against us. As one grim commentary put it, orgasm itself has been reduced to a sacrament of nihilism, a momentary bliss that plants a seed of death in the soul. Pleasure divorced from love or creation becomes tied to emptiness and contempt. The person indulging in cruel or degrading fantasies is unwittingly normalizing cruelty and degradation in life. Each private vice, each click of sordid content, trains the psyche to accept domination and submission as normal. Thus, the pursuit of bliss insulates the conscience from awakening. As long as the individual feels a flicker of personal pleasure, however fleeting or hollow, they see no need to question the larger reality. They become complacent, apathetic to freedom, so long as their feeds and fixes keep coming. Bread and circuses worked for the Romans, Netflix and narcotics work just as well today. All the while, the money magicians behind the scenes keep the illusion going. They conjure currency from nothing, smoke machines, pulleys and cogs creating the grand illusion called money, and with it finance both sides of our self-destruction. One famous expose of banking called it the most blatant scam in history, revealing how this conjured money fuels the cause of wars, boom-bust cycles, inflation, prosperity at the whim of a hidden cartel. We toil and consume under the spell of this illusion, scarcely realizing that our very labor and hunger have been commodified. Our debts keep us on a treadmill, our panics and manias line the pockets of financiers who bet on every rise and fall. The creature from Jekyll Island, that is, the central banking system, sits like a parasitic god at the heart of our economy, demanding fealty. Under its influence, debt itself becomes the lifeblood. In modern America, debt is money, and endless credit expansion the creed. This allows consumption beyond our means, temporarily sating desires while secretly tightening the chains. The endgame, if one follows the road, is a form of global feudalism, a new world order where consumer goods vanish and men are in bondage. Already we see how an overly indebted, pleasure-chasing populace can be corralled. They are lured by easy credit and cheap thrills into a pen of dependency. As one forecaster warned, whether through sudden crises or gradual patient gradualism, the outcome is the same: men reduced to the level of serfs. High-tech feudalism ruled by a powerful few. In our ceaseless consuming, we unwittingly construct our own cage. At times, I feel despair nibbling at the edges of my mind. How do we escape a trap that plays upon our very appetites and fears? How do we restore genuine meaning in a culture that devours meaning as soon as it sprouts? I have no simple answers, but I do have the clarity of seeing the pattern now. I see that our hunger is not a shame to be exploited, but a signal. It tells us that something vital is missing in our society. People are hungry for truth, for connection, for transcendence. These are legitimate needs that have been corrupted into endless wants. The solution, I suspect, begins with each of us reclaiming our appetite for what truly nourishes: real community, honest work, unvarnished truth, beauty, faith, love. We must become conscious of how we are being fed toxins for the soul. Only then can we push the plate away. In the dystopian allegory that is our world, the final scene has not yet been written. The elite narrative would have us believe we have no choice but to continue this cycle of consumption unto death. That the revolution of eating and being eaten does not end when power is seized. It ends when there is nothing left to destroy. But there is a glimmer of hope in recognizing this very fact. If we can see that the only thing left to destroy in the end would be ourselves, perhaps we can halt before that terminal point. For now, however, the image is undeniably bleak: a society exhausting itself, consuming itself one soul at a time. I often return in my mind to the haunting warning from Scripture: my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. In our case, the knowledge we lack is of our own condition. We do not recognize our spiritual malnutrition even as we become skeletal in meaning, obese in distraction. If we gain that knowledge, if we see the strings of the puppeteers, the false food we've been sold, then hunger itself can become our weapon. A righteous hunger for truth and authenticity could yet topple the mightiest Tower of Babel. The first step is to stop consuming the lies, to fast from the poison and seek the bread of truth once more. Until then, the banquet of illusion continues, and we teeter at its table, knives in hand, carving up the last scraps of a culture that once had a soul. In this dark vision, perhaps the only light is that which glows faintly in individual hearts that refuse to be satisfied with ashes. I cling to the belief that such hearts exist, that among the people are those who will choose to hunger for something more than what the elite's menu offers. They will rediscover sacred meaning amid the madness. They will teach others to taste it. And maybe, just maybe, we will learn to stop devouring ourselves before there is nothing left. For if we fail, the epitaph of our civilization will be a bitter one. Consumed by our own consumption, we vanished into the emptiness we embraced. In that cautionary fate lies the final lesson of the shattered logos, a lesson I pray we do not learn too late. Part 3, Mammon's Engine. Chapter 7, The Creature's Lair, Private Cartels, and the Currency of Chains. I stand before the austere marble facade of the central bank, feeling as though I'm at the mouth of a great cave. It resides in there, the creature, ancient and insatiable. In the dim silence of its halls, I imagine I hear its slow breathing, the hum of vaults and wires, the whisper of transactions. I have chased Mammon's engine to its lair, and now I tremble with a mix of fear and resolve. How many victims has this creature devoured? For generations, the creature has continued to dine upon its hapless victims while hiding in plain sight, veiled by marble columns and the public's trust. I feel a flash of anger cut through my anxiety. Anger at how expertly this monster has concealed itself as a pillar of stability, even benevolence, while binding us all in chains of our own currency. This creature was born in secrecy. The official story says the Federal Reserve was created to stabilize the economy, but the real birth was more akin to a conspiracy. In 1910, a clandestine gathering of powerful bankers stole away from New York under cover of night. As financial journalist B.C. Forbes later described, a party of the nation's greatest bankers left on a private railroad car under cover of darkness, stealthily hieing hundreds of miles south to a remote island. There on Jekyll Island, behind locked doors and drawn shades, they spent a week huddled together. They spoke in whispers, never even using their last names, so that not even the servants would know who they were. This strangest, most secret expedition in the history of American finance was not a gentleman's duck to hunting holiday. It was the moment the creature took form. By the time they emerged, they had drafted the blueprint for a new kind of banking cartel. Their goal, in plain terms, was the structure and operation of a banking cartel that would maximize their profits by minimizing competition and enlist the power of government to enforce their agreement. In that smoky private lair, they conceived what would become the Federal Reserve System, a creature of their own making, birthed for their benefit. From its inception, this central bank was deliberately designed as a cartel cloaked in public authority. The very name Federal Reserve was a masterstroke of deception. It isn't truly federal, a government agency, and it holds no reserve of wealth for the people. Indeed, the Federal Reserve banks are not even banks in the traditional sense. The men of Jekyll Island knew the public would never accept an explicit bankers' cartel running the nation's money. So they gave it an innocuous name and crafted an illusion of government oversight. In reality, this structure was pure cartel, a partnership of powerful banks operating against the public interest. They secured a monopoly over the issuance of currency, effectively taking control of the lifeblood of the economy. The scheme was modeled on earlier ventures like the Bank of England, where centuries before another cabal had struck a deal to trade government debt for the power to create money. In 1694, a group of monetary scientists in England convinced the crown to let them conjure money from nothing, lend it to the government, and collect interest on it. Double interest, in fact, on the same nothing. That charter birthed the world's first central bank, a strange creature that took its initial breath and began an epoch of private money power. The Federal Reserve was the American offspring of this lineage, another creature in the same brood. Here, in the creature's lair, money itself is forged into chains. The dollars in your pocket feel like currency, but in truth, each is an IOU linked to this banking cabal. The Fed and its member banks manufacture dollars by extending loans, by weaving debt out of thin air, and every one of those dollars comes with an invisible shackle, an obligation to pay it back with interest. In effect, the cartel set up a system in which it would collect interest on money which it creates out of nothing, taking a cut from every dollar created. It is a perpetual toll, an unearned tribute on all economic activity. I almost gasp when I finally grasp this. Every US dollar is born as debt owed to banks, a subtle chain looped around the economy's neck. No wonder one analyst called the Federal Reserve the supreme instrument of usury. IT institutionalized usury on a national scale, legalizing an infinite interest racket. Even when the bank's gambles go wrong, the losses are passed to the public. The cartel's design included using the government as an agent to shift losses onto taxpayers. Debt and profit, risk and loss, heads they win, tails we lose. The other arm of our financial fetters is inflation, the slow debasement of the currency that quietly leaches wealth from the populace. Inflation is the cartel's hidden tax. The Fed was sold as a way to prevent the boom-bust panics of the 19th century, to protect the currency's value. Instead, it has presided over a relentless erosion of the dollar's purchasing power, an unfair tax on anyone holding cash. By increasing the money supply at will, the money masters silently siphon off the value of our earnings and savings. We are like prisoners on a treadmill. No matter how fast we run, the finish line financial security keeps receding as the value of each dollar shrinks. This inflationary mechanism was no accident. It is a hidden global power at work. The creature benefits from inflation because it indebts the government and public even further. Standing in this quiet lobby, I feel the weight of those invisible chains clinging to me. I realize that from the moment I earned my first paycheck, I have been laboring within a system built to keep me one step behind. The currency itself is rigged to favor its issuers. Our society's wealth flows upward, in interest payments and asset inflation, into the vaults of those who sit in the creature's inner sanctum. This is a financial empire, ruled by private cartels from behind the curtain of central banks. Its subjects toil unaware of their servitude, even thinking themselves free, while the lords of finance grow fat on their labor. The creature has been described as one of the most dangerous creatures ever to stalk our land, a beast of prey rather than a servant of the people. Indeed, after over a century, the creature still remains undaunted in his lair despite attempts to slay it. The Federal Reserve and its kin have entrenched themselves as indispensable, beyond question. Modern society's very money supply is chained to them. I clench my fists as the realization fully sinks in. We live under an invisible dominion, a tyranny of debt and money. This private cartel in its lair issues the currency of chains that binds the world. To understand how these chains enslave not just our commerce but our very souls, I must venture deeper into the darkness, into the arcane mechanics and psychological spells by which money becomes our master. The creature's power is not only structural, but profoundly psychological. What began as a secret cabal on Jekyll Island has grown into a global system of control. In the next chamber of this journey, I will witness how debt is sanctified and sorcery masquerades as salvation, ensnaring us in a bondage that feels almost holy. Chapter 8. Debt as Sacrament. How money magic feeds eternal servitude. I dream of a grand cathedral bathed in a cold golden light. In place of an altar, there stands a massive ledger book, pages open, illuminated by the glow of LED screens. Hooded figures, the high priests of finance, swing censers that smell of ink and burnt paper. The congregation before them is us, citizens, consumers, debtors. We kneel not in worship of a deity of love or truth, but in obligation to an abstract power, the power of debt. In unison, we recite the creed, "In God we trust," embossed on every bill, even as Mammon is the God we truly serve. This is the new sacrament of our technocratic faith, credit and debt, created at the altar of central banks and absorbed into every soul as naturally as breath. I blink away the reverie and realize it's not truly a dream, it's an accurate metaphor. We have constructed a religion around money. Its rituals are the monthly billing cycle and the quarterly earnings report. Its priests and bishops are bankers and policymakers. Its scriptures are spreadsheets and Federal Reserve minutes. And its sacrament, binding all adherents in a covenant of servitude, is debt. Modern society does not call this a religion, of course. It calls it economics, finance, the normal way of the world. Yet everywhere are the telltale signs of worship. Political. Leaders urge us to have faith in the market as the ultimate provider, to go out and spend as though consumer spending were a patriotic duty. Central bankers and economists are treated as high priests of prosperity, solemnly interpreting the arcane scriptures of fiscal policy that none but they can fathom. When recessions hit or markets panic, our society reacts just as ancient civilizations did when angering a god, with panic sacrifices. In 2008, it was massive bailouts of banks. In the Eurozone, it was harsh austerity measures, offerings on the altar of the economy to appease the wrath of the invisible market gods. These are presented as painful but necessary rites to restore confidence, that ever-fragile state of grace in the financial world. Confidence. I note the irony that this word has the same root as faith. In this secular religion of money, confidence is both currency and communion. Without it, the entire belief system collapses. We speak of credit, from the Latin credere, to believe, and indeed, money is ultimately belief. It works only because we collectively trust that it has value. The money magicians know this, and so they shroud their operations in mystique and jargon, fostering belief through obscurity. Witness the magic with a few keystrokes. Central bankers summon dollars, euros, yen out of the void. This is high alchemy. As G. Edward Griffin wrote, they use mirrors and smoke machines, the pulleys, cogs, and wheels to create the grand illusion called money. The reference to smoke and mirrors is apt. The process is deliberately opaque. When I first tried to understand how a dollar comes into being, I found myself drowning in terminology, open market operations, quantitative easing, discount rates. It seemed hopelessly complicated until I stumbled on a simple summary. The entire function of the Federal Reserve's machine is to convert debt into money. It's just that simple, wrote one astonished researcher. The Fed takes government bonds, debt, and writes a check against nothing to buy them, creating fiat dollars on the spot. By calling those bonds reserves, the central bank then uses them as the base to create many additional dollars which are loaned into the economy. In the end, new money enters circulation through the banking system as debt owed back to those banks. The process is elegant in its sorcery. It conjures money out of nothing, yet leaves the public on the hook to repay it as though it were real. The partnership is clear. Congress and the banking cartel have entered into a partnership whereby the government gets instant access to spending without raising taxes outright, and the banking cartel gets a perpetual override on every American dollar created. In plainer terms, the financiers collect a steady tithe interest on the nation's money, and politicians get to distribute the feast through deficit spending without directly alerting the voters. It is a brilliant, if devilish, arrangement. Modern money magic at its finest. Little wonder the authors of this system described its workings in terms befitting a stage illusion. They named it the Mandrake mechanism, after a comic strip magician who could make things vanish and reappear at will. The deeper one looks, the more it indeed resembles a con game. As one Fed publication quietly admitted, the process is not meant to be logical but to confuse and deceive. The trick lies in using technical words that sound as if they explain something, when in fact they obscure the simple fraud underneath. In the end, money appears where there was none, and we, the public, accept it as real wealth. Such is the power of collective faith. If money creation is the ritual, then debt is the sacrament that completes the spell. We imbibe it from our earliest adult years. At 19, I signed the dotted line on a student loan document. It felt as routine as registering for classes. In truth, it was a baptism into perpetual obligation. Years later, I am still paying tithes to that decision, the debt growing lighter only slowly, like a penance for the temerity of getting an education. I am hardly unique. Today, debt has become a fundamental feature of life, from student loans to credit cards to mortgages. Upon graduation, young adults are handed not a Bible or moral creed, but a credit score and a coupon for a new line of credit. To buy a modest home often requires bending the knee to the bank for a 30-year mortgage, a 3-decade promise that you will sacrifice a portion of every paycheck to this overlord. The particulars of our lives may differ, but the pattern is consistent. A debt-ridden population is a compliant population. Chain people to monthly payments for decades, and you ensure they remain focused on meeting those obligations, with little energy to question larger structures, writes one analyst bluntly. Indeed, I have felt it in my own exhausted evenings after work, when thoughts of protesting the system or pursuing a passion give way to calculating bills and interest. Economic fear keeps us in line. Fear of losing one's job, one's home, one's ability to provide for family becomes a powerful tool to enforce conformity. How ingenious! This regime achieves a quiet tyranny over the soul without any need for barbed wire or gulags. We bind ourselves with contracts and call it freedom. The golden handcuffs are slipped on the moment we sign for that car or swipe that credit card. But they feel like choice, like adulthood, like progress. It is only years later, when one is deeply enmeshed, that the fetters become painfully apparent. In earlier eras, religions spoke of souls in bondage to sin. Today we have whole societies in bondage to debt. The psychological effect is similar. Debt, in its essence, is a promise of future labor, a claim on your time and effort that someone else holds. To live heavily in debt is to wake each day with a portion of your life already owned by another. The stress, the anxiety, the faint gnawing panic that comes when bills mount and income dwindles. Is this not a kind of spiritual oppression? As one commentary noted, debt is the mechanism of spiritual capture in the modern age. A person in deep debt often experiences anxiety, fear for the future, and a sense of diminished self-worth, feelings eerily akin to religious guilt or metaphysical dread. You cannot easily follow your calling or stand up for your beliefs. When missing a single paycheck could mean eviction or hunger. The debtor's subservience is, conversely, the creditor's power. I have watched friends censor their own speech at work, terrified of being fired and defaulting on loans. I have seen talented people shelve creative ambitions in favor of drudgery because their debts demand it. We are not free to choose our path. Our obligations dictate our life choices. This yoke is so normalized we barely see it, but it is there, pressing on countless necks. The more I contemplate it, the more our entire social order begins to resemble an enormous feudal system, a financial feudalism. In the old days, serfs paid rents to lords, and were bound to the land. Now renters and mortgage holders alike are bound to monthly payments, and paychecks pass upward to landlords, banks, and credit card companies in an endless tribute. It's telling that even our government operates permanently in the red, servicing trillions in debt. The nation itself is a debtor, ensuring that policies will always favor keeping the debt machine running at all costs. Corporations, too, leverage themselves to the hilt to finance expansion, rendering them slavishly focused on short-term profits. They cannot afford an altruistic pause, lest the quarterly earnings falter and loans come due. Everywhere it's the same dynamic. Lives, organizations, whole countries harnessed to an engine of debt, compelled to feed it continuously. In this way, human lives become fuel for the economy. In a very real way, the debt-based economy turns human lives into fuel. One writer observed starkly. Our time, our creativity, our dreams, all are conscripted. The financial system wants not just our money, but us. It wants all of you, your time on earth, your attention, your relationships, and even your inner world, because all these can be monetized or leveraged. What is sacred or personal in a world where even love and leisure are branded? Where our most intimate data and thoughts are harvested by tech companies in league with finance to predict and influence our spending? The cult of mammon is comprehensive. It leaves no part of life untouched. We devote our days to chasing dollars, and with those dollars we purchase the very chains that bind us. A tidy, self-reinforcing system. I cannot help but feel a swell of anger and grief as I acknowledge these truths. Anger that so many of us, myself included, walked willingly into this trap, lured by the promise of prosperity. Grief for the years of life that debt has quietly stolen from millions. The family moments missed by the mother working overtime to pay off creditors. The talents never developed by the student who had to skip college to avoid loans. The retirements indefinitely deferred because one can't ever quite catch up. This system feeds on our eternal servitude. It needs us to carry debt to keep the illusion of wealth expanding. One might even say debt has become a perverse sacrament of social membership. To have a good credit score, a mortgage, a student loan, is to be seen as a responsible, upstanding citizen. Those who refuse or escape the debt treadmill are labeled marginal, off-grid, even irresponsible. Thus, servitude is lauded as virtue. Here we see how money magic and psychological control intertwine. The very thing that enslaves us is sold as the ticket to the American dream. In hushed moments, when I am alone with my thoughts, a question echoes in my mind. What is the endgame? If this is a religion, what salvation does it offer? But there is no salvation, only a treadmill that must never stop. The economy must grow, debts must be paid and repaid in endless churn, or the whole edifice collapses. And so we run, generation after generation, on the wheel of finance, our spiritual hunger unsatisfied even as we are stuffed with consumer goods. The emotional toll is palpable, a hollowing out of meaning, a quiet desperation behind the eyes. We are told that material comfort is progress, yet so many of us feel spiritually bankrupt. The sacrament of debt does not nourish the soul, it numbs it. In the final analysis, this system demands not just our work but our hearts. It wants faith, faith that without it we are lost, that there is no alternative. This is why, when cracks in the system appear, the response is often fear and rage. We have bet our lives on this covenant, and the thought of it failing is terrifying. Better to double down, take on more debt, print more money, perform another round of sacrifices, anything to keep the false god appeased. My reflection turns dark as I recall a chilling comparison. In ancient cults, when the harvest failed or the empire faltered, priests would sacrifice human lives to appease the gods. Have we not done the same? When the great housing bubble burst in 2008, it was as if the market demanded a sacrifice of jobs and homes. Millions were foreclosed or made unemployed, lives upended to purge the excess credit. The prescribed cure for indebted nations in recent times has been austerity, entire populations made to surrender healthcare, education, and security to satisfy faceless creditors. And if even that falls short, there is always war, the sacrament of blood. It is no coincidence that world wars and major conflicts have repeatedly reset economies. World War II is often credited with ending the Great Depression by a ghastly calculus. Mass destruction and death jolted the machinery back to life and set the stage for new growth. The money magicians know this truth well. As Griffin observed, modern wars simply would not be possible without fiat money. With the power to conjure money, governments can wage war on credit. And as long as the mandrake mechanism exists, future wars are inevitable. How sobering to realize that our financial system treats human lives as just another input, expendable fuel to keep itself alive. Debt and war, interest and blood, all feed the same engine. This is the inverted morality of our age. Debt is sanctified, wealth is deified, and human well-being is collateral damage. I think of the old warning from Scripture, you cannot serve both God and mammon. Yet modern culture has found a way to serve mammon as God. We take the sacrament of debt. We bow to the altar of the bank, and in return, we are promised material salvation, the house, the car, the education, the retirement. But it's a false salvation, always just out of reach for the many, even as it richly rewards the few. Our chains are disguised as choices. Our slavery is sold to us as security. The realization of this strikes me to the core. I feel an upsurge of determination amidst the despair, an insistence that this spell can be broken. If debt is a kind of sorcery, perhaps awareness is the counter-spell. To break a curse, one must first name it. And so I name it now. We have been enslaved by a cult of debt, by money magic that enriches a parasitic empire. In the next chapter, I will step back to see the broader picture of that empire. How does it maintain its grip over entire nations and eras? How do the elite sorcerers of finance and power keep stability for themselves even as they inflict cycles of boom and bust and even collapse on the rest of us? The answers lie in the deep patterns of history, from Rome's tactics of rule to the new digital dominions being built around us. We will see how collapse itself can be controlled, harnessed as a tool of domination, and how an ancient promise of peace can mask the tightening of tyranny. Chapter 9. Roman peace, modern, empire, elite stability through controlled collapse. I walk through the ruins of the Roman Forum on a wet afternoon, the broken columns rising like ghosts from the mud. It strikes me that these stones have witnessed this story before. Here lies the shell of a once great republic that gave way to empire, that promised Pax Romana, Roman peace, even as it hollowed out the liberty of its citizens. I close my eyes and almost hear the distant roar of the Colosseum, the cheers of a populace distracted by spectacle while their freedoms slipped away. Bread and circuses, Juvenal had scornfully described the strategy, free grain and gladiatorial games, to keep the masses sated and docile. In Rome's final centuries, the historian Tacitus tells us, the people had become strangers to public duty, concerned only with their own pleasures. The state grew corrupt and top-heavy, and eventually it began to crumble. They make a desert and call it peace. Tacitus wrote of how Rome dealt with its enemies, but it could just as well describe how the empire dealt with its own people's spirit. Now, 2 millennia later, I feel an uneasy sense of déjà vu. Are we living through a modern replay of this tragedy? Our elites, too, speak of peace and progress, yet they preside over a system that alienates and exhausts its subjects. Our society hasn't fallen to barbarians at the gate, not yet, but something within it feels as broken as these columns, a loss of trust, a decay of meaning, a sneaking suspicion that the grand edifice of progress might be a facade covering rot. History shows that great empires maintain stability for the few in charge, even as they extract life from the many below. In the late Roman Empire, power and wealth concentrated into an elite class, while ordinary citizens gradually lost connection to the civic realm. One account notes how Romans became increasingly disengaged, more passionate about chariot races and feasts than about the duties of republican virtue as their empire aged. The populace submitted to autocratic rule in exchange for entertainment and grain. It was a trade-off of freedom for comfort, engagement for indifference, and it led to what one scholar called civic death. People abandoned the public sphere altogether, withdrawing into private indulgences while acquiescing to authoritarian rule. The outward appearance was one of peace and stability, Pax Romana, but underneath, the society was growing weaker, its foundation gnawed away by corruption and apathy. The Pax was illusory, a calm imposed by conquest abroad and coercion at home. In the end, that peace was shattered. The Western Empire fell, succumbing to external invasions and internal rot alike. Rome's collapse was not truly sudden. It was the culmination of long decay masked by centuries of apparent order. If Rome offers a cautionary tale, our present world offers an unnerving parallel. We too have an elite who insist that their rule brings peace and progress. The American-led global order after World War II was termed Pax Americana, promising democracy and prosperity under U.S. hegemony. And for a time it appeared so. Living standards rose for many. Open conflict between great powers was held at bay. But behind the scenes, another form of concentration was occurring: the consolidation of economic power in a transnational elite and the construction of a financial system that quietly transcended national democracies. The post-war period saw the rise of technocratic institutions, the IMF, World Bank, multinational corporations, and not least the central banking network, that operated beyond the direct oversight of any electorate. They preached a gospel of global markets and free flow of capital, which in practice often meant wealth flowing to those at the top and vulnerabilities flowing to those at the bottom. Over the past few decades, signs of strain have multiplied. We see environmental catastrophe, widening inequality, global conflict, and the rise of dangerous technology looming. Economic inequality especially has reached levels not seen since the Gilded Age. The promises of neoliberal globalization have left many working people in Western countries feeling betrayed, while those in poorer nations toil in sweatshops to provide goods for the richer. The social fabric phrase, political polarization, distrust of institutions, and despair manifesting in epidemics of suicide and addiction mark our era. These are our barbarians at the gate, not literal invaders but systemic crises that threaten to exploit our weakened cohesion. And how have our leaders responded? Largely by urging us to stay the course, to trust them, and perhaps to accept a bit more top-down control for our own good. There is talk among elites of a great reset, a reorganization of the global system, presumably under their guidance. Always, the narrative is that more centralization, more surveillance, more technocratic management will save us from the chaos. It is as though they offer Roman peace as a solution to modern troubles, a peace that really means acquiescence to their rule, a progress that requires ordinary people to surrender autonomy. A pattern emerges. When crises loom, those in power often use them to tighten their grip. This is controlled collapse. Not that the elite can always prevent things from breaking, but when breakage happens, it is managed in a way that preserves their dominance or even enhances it. One need only look at the financial crises of recent memory. In 2008, reckless speculation by major banks precipitated a near collapse of the global financial system. Panic rippled through markets. Ordinary people's pensions and jobs were on the line. Swiftly, governments intervened, not by punishing the culprits, but by bailing out the banks. The U.S. Federal Reserve and Treasury effectively socialized the banks' losses, printing money and indebting the public in order to save the very institutions that caused the disaster. The result, the crisis passed for the elites in the boardrooms, who even awarded themselves bonuses in its wake, while millions of average families lost homes and livelihoods. The pattern held in the Eurozone a few years later. Debtor countries like Greece were not allowed to default, which might hurt big lenders, but were instead put through draconian austerity to ensure foreign banks got paid. As one commentator put it, creditors demand entire populations give up healthcare, education, and security to satisfy abstract creditors. The people sacrificed, the banks survived. Collapse? Controlled? It is hard to overstate how deliberate this is. The architects of the Federal Reserve had explicitly built a system to protect big banks from competition and from their own follies. One of the Jekyll Island objectives was to use government power to shift inevitable banking losses onto the public ledger. Over a century, this scheme has played out repeatedly. In each cycle of boom and bust, the largest players are rescued or merge and grow larger, while smaller competitors and the general public bear the brunt of the bust. Competition is a sin. Oil baron John D. Rockefeller once quipped. He would no doubt approve of how banking crises eliminate weaker firms and further concentrate the industry, often with government-brokered mergers. Thus, with each collapse, the surviving elites tighten their dominance. It's controlled in the sense that, even if they didn't intend the timing of a given crisis, they certainly control the response to ensure their own stability. And if anything, the bailouts and too-big-to-fail doctrines make future crises more likely, since the big players take ever riskier bets knowing they'll be saved. This in turn keeps the cycle going. A controlled demolition repeated as needed to maintain the hierarchy. If financial crashes are one form of managed collapse, war is another, even more brutal form. War has always been a means for elites to secure or expand power. What's different in the modern era is how central banking has enabled war at an unprecedented scale. Earlier, I noted Griffin's observation that without fiat money, most modern wars would have been impossible. Here's why. When states had to fund war by taxing citizens directly or borrowing gold, there were natural limits to how much war they could afford. But once nations could print money or bank credit to finance conflict, the only limit was the tolerance for inflation. The great total wars of the 20th century, the two world wars, were fueled in large part by paper money and central bank credit. The elites learned that war can be economically beneficial after the devastation, at least for those in position to profit from rebuilding in new markets. As mentioned, World War II ended the Depression in America. It's a cynical calculus, tens of millions dead. But the factories roared back to life, and the U.S. emerged a global superpower, its financiers presiding over Bretton Woods and the new dollar-dominated order. War, in effect, acted as a violent reset that the elite then controlled the terms of. This is not to reduce war to economics alone. Ideology and aggression play their roles. But when we see how eagerly financial and corporate interests feed from the trough of war, arms contracts, resource grabs, loans for reconstruction, the pattern is unmistakable. Even in more recent times, some leaders and thinkers have floated war as a solution to economic stagnation, a chilling echo of ancient sacrificial rites. When the market god is displeased, slow growth, high debt, it demands sacrifice. And war provides that in spades, lives, infrastructure, whole cities cast into the fire, and afterward, a chance to rebuild with new debt, of course. All this occurs under noble pretenses: liberation, defense, peace. The empire's violence is always couched as benevolence. They create chaos, then call it peace once the opposition is crushed and their own control is secure. Consider how even peace itself can be weaponized. After major wars or upheavals, there's often an effort to establish a new order to prevent future conflict. Sounds laudable. Who doesn't want peace and stability? But look closely. Whose stability and on what terms? The Roman Empire, at its height, justified its domination by claiming to provide the world a peace pax romana that lesser peoples could not achieve on their own. In modern times, the end of the Cold War brought talk of a new world order. Some envisioned a kind of global governance that would finally ensure harmony and free trade everywhere. In truth, what emerged was a unipolar moment where one superpower and its financial institutions could set the terms globally. There was peace among great powers, yes, but plenty of controlled chaos on the peripheries. Proxy wars, regime changes, whenever a smaller nation defied the rules. It was peace through superior firepower and IMF conditionalities, one might say. Now, as we move further into the 21st century, a new vision is taking shape, a highly technologized global governance, perhaps a single unified technocratic authority that transcends nation-states. The sales pitch is already being made. Global problems, climate change, pandemics, cyber threats require global solutions and centralized coordination. Imagine a one-world government or technocratic regime that claims to rule for the benefit of all humanity. To many, exhausted by endless crises, such a vision might sound appealing. Who doesn't want unity, safety, an end to war? I can almost hear the future slogans of this order: one Earth, one peace, one economy. But I also hear the voice of warning in my mind. Perhaps the whisper of those long-dead Romans who saw the Republic fall. If such global power is born from absolutism, from the final triumph of control over freedom, it would imperil the human spirit on a scale never seen before, a contemporary writer notes grimly. The shape of this future empire is coming into focus. It is technocratic, cashless, possibly even biometrically managed. It promises peace and efficiency, but demands total surveillance and obedience. In short, it is techno-feudalism, the fusion of cutting-edge technology with ancient feudal power dynamics. In this envisioned system, a tiny elite would wield unprecedented power over the masses, using digital tools to monitor and micromanage society. Already today, we see the harbingers, digital giants like Google, Amazon, Facebook, Tencent acting as platform sovereigns. Private corporations with quasi-governmental authority over vast domains of data and communication. These digital monopolies, as one analysis puts it, behave as techno-feudal lords, controlling the flow of information and extracting rent value from every user under their dominion. They shape what we see, what we buy, even what we think, by the algorithms they design. If left unchecked, this concentration of digital power could slide into outright authoritarianism, culminating in a dark Orwellian world. where everyone is watched, profiled, and manipulated by invisible algorithms, and genuine human autonomy is all but gone. This is not science fiction. It is the logical culmination of trends already underway. High-tech surveillance and AI-driven control are the modern equivalent of the Roman legions stationed in every province. But now there will be nowhere for discontent to hide, not even in one's own mind, if the engineers of this order perfect their tools. Perhaps most insidiously, this new empire will come smiling. There may not be a dramatic declaration of tyranny. Instead, it will be sold as the solution to our fears. Imagine they will say, no more financial crashes, because every transaction is tracked and regulated in real time. No more pandemics, because we have biometric IDs and AI monitoring to contain outbreaks. No more terror or war, because a unified world. Authority prevents any rebellion. It might arise, as one writer speculated, in response to global crises, where people, exhausted by fear, are willing to trade freedom for security. A climate disaster, a massive cyber attack, a worldwide economic meltdown. Any of these could panic the public into accepting what they would otherwise reject. The language of progress and peace will cloak the iron fist. After all, what regime ever announced itself as evil? Even the most oppressive systems often claim to be for the good of the people. A global technocracy would likely preserve the rituals of democracy, just as the Roman emperors kept the Senate as a vestigial show or as modern. Authoritarian states hold sham elections, but the real decisions would be made behind closed doors by an intertwining of political and corporate and banking elites. We already see elements of this. Policy dictated by central banks and trade agreements rather than legislatures, big tech CEOs with more influence than elected officials, intelligence agencies partnering with social media to steer public opinion. It's a stable dystopia that is forming. Stable in that the elite's position is secure, dystopian in that the rest of us exist in a controlled, surveilled, and spiritually diminished state. As I contemplate this possible future, rage and sorrow war inside me. Rage at the audacity of those who would play chess with entire societies, sacrificing pawns, that is, people, in pursuit of their greater good, which always seems to enrich or empower themselves. Sorrow at how many of my fellow citizens seem lulled or resigned, distracted by the digital circus, or too busy scrabbling to pay bills to notice the cage being built around them. Many have already succumbed to a kind of learned helplessness, a comfortable servitude where as long as the streaming entertainment and pizza deliveries keep coming, they ask no questions. It is the bread and circuses of Rome, updated for the internet age. A populace might submit politically while distracting itself with endless consumption, as one analysis warned, resulting in a vision of civic death. In my darker moments, I too feel that temptation to just give in, enjoy whatever consumer comforts I can, and tune out the rest. What can I do anyway against such vast forces? The thought slithers into my mind like a sedative. That is the voice of submission, of despair masquerading as contentment. It's how empires win, by convincing people that resistance is futile and ignorance is bliss. Yet, another voice within urges me to remember the truth and speak it, even if only to myself. No empire is eternal, no chains are unbreakable. The technocrats and oligarchs want us to believe that their system is inevitable, the final perfected form of society. But history is rife with inevitable empires that fell. The Roman elite in the 4th century could scarcely imagine their world being overturned, but it was. Does that guarantee liberation in our case? No. A collapse of the current order could just as easily lead to something even worse if we are not vigilant. In fact, that is precisely the danger, that the collapse, economic, environmental, social, might be orchestrated or opportunistically used by an elite to impose a new order that is harsher still. A one-world ideology enforcing uniformity and obedience would extinguish what makes us human. The final dystopia could arrive wearing the mantle of peace, a Roman peace, quiet and dead. As the saying goes, the final victory of the devil is to convince us he doesn't exist. Likewise, the final victory of this empire would be to convince us that its yoke is actually our salvation. Looking around these ruins, I realize that I stand at a personal crossroads much like our civilization does. One path is to continue down the road of least resistance, to let Mammon's engine run its course, to become a well-fed serf in a techno-feudal world, gradually numbed into acquiescence. That path ends with me as an obedient servant in a society where authentic freedom and joy are extinguished, replaced by the managed pleasures and trivialities doled out by our digital lords. The other path is uncertain. It is the path of awareness, of resistance in ways large or small, of keeping the flame of human spirit alive. It might lead to hardship, even to being an outsider in one's own time, but at least it is real. Real life, not a simulation of life inside a gilded cage. Our conversation in these pages has been heavy, laden with dystopian imagery and somber truths. Yet I notice that even as I write, even as I face these grim realities, there is a spark of defiance lighting itself in my chest. It's a small flame of hope, stubborn and irrational perhaps, but present. It whispers that the engine of mammon ultimately runs on our participation. If enough of us see the chains, we cannot even begin to loosen them, or rather, because we see the chains, we can begin to loosen them. The first act of liberation is to recognize the bondage. I have peered into the creature's lair and named the cartel. I have understood the false sacrament that keeps us docile. I have seen how the empire weaponizes collapse to tighten control. This knowledge is painful, but it is also empowering. It means the spell is not complete, the future is not written in stone. We may yet have a choice in how this story ends. As I leave the forum and step back into the modern city, I catch my reflection in a rain puddle, a lone figure dwarfed by relics of glory and ruin. I realize that Mammon's engine is not just out there in banks and algorithms, it is also in here, in our own hearts whenever we consent to the logic of greed and fear. The true battlefield is the human spirit. Rome fell, but humanity went on. If a new empire rises, it too will be a hollow victory if it gains the whole world but destroys the soul of humankind. Perhaps our task is to ensure that does not happen, to keep lit the flame of genuine freedom, creativity, love, meaning. This could be the work of a lifetime, even of generations. It may well be that we cannot prevent the coming of a technocratic dystopia, but we can resist it within ourselves, refuse to worship at its altar, refuse to forget what it means to be fully human. In the meantime, the engines of mammon still churn. The creature in its lair still plots its controlled collapses and reaps its profits. The chains of currency and debt still bind billions in unseen fetters. But I have ceased to be a silent, passive acolyte. I write these words as an act of rebellion and an act of faith, faith that understanding can lead to change. The peace the elite promises us is that of a perfectly ordered ant colony. The progress they sell is that of a machine, efficient but lifeless. I reject that in my heart. I choose the messy, unpredictable, sometimes painful reality of being human, of striving for a justice that cannot be measured in profit and loss. There is an ancient longing in us for true freedom, not the false freedom to consume, but the freedom to live with dignity and authenticity. As I conclude part 3 of this journey, I feel we stand on the brink of a new chapter in our collective story. The engine can still be stopped, or reimagined, if enough hands reach for the controls. The future, dystopian as it may appear, is not a fixed destiny. Mammon's engine may dominate our present, but it need not rule our future. For now, I take solace in speaking truth, in the hope that truth can spread. Even in a controlled collapse, cracks appear, and through those cracks, the light of human conscience can shine. The Roman Empire fell, but human ideas of liberty and virtue survived to inspire anew. So too might this modern empire of finance and technology one day give way to a renaissance of the human spirit. Until then, we watch, we learn, we resist in whatever ways we can. The creature's reign will last until the day we collectively decide we've had enough, and on that day, Mammon's engine will grind to a halt, and the long night of servitude will give way to a new dawn. Part 4, Shattered Sanctuaries. Chapter 10, Spiritual Homelessness. Wandering the edges of Xanadu, he stands at the glowing frontier of a neon paradise, gazing inwards. In the distance rises a pleasure dome built of light and shadow, a digital Xanadu promising endless delights. The night air hums with seductive illusions, screens flaring with kaleidoscopic temptations, each billboard smile concealing a sinister hunger. Here on the edges of Xanadu, he feels like a ghost at the window of heaven. Liberation was promised within those shining walls. Yet he wanders outside, spiritually homeless and unseen. The lights play tricks on his eyes. Beyond the gleam, the original fire of meaning is flickering, distant and fragile. In this hall of mirrors, every pleasure is a hollow echo of the self, every invitation an illusion. He can sense a quiet longing within, a yearning for something more real, something that no pixel or pleasure can provide. But that something, call it truth, call it God, lies beyond his reach, leaving him in exile at the border of bliss. I have become a stranger in the cosmos, an orphan of the divine. There is a pain in this metaphysical dislocation, a sense that I was cast out of some Eden I barely remember. The stars above are cold and silent. I search them for a sign that I belong, but the heavens return no answer. All around me, others seem to move with purpose, immersed in causes, identities, and desires that give them direction. Yet I remain unmoored, lacking a home in any creed or community. My childhood faith crumbled early. Trauma and disillusionment exiled me from the comfort of believing I was watched over by a loving higher power. Now, in the wild freedom of unbelief, my soul drifts. I wander the edges of every ideology and tribe, never fully at home. The hunger for meaning is a permanent feature of the human condition, and I feel it intensely. But in this age, not everything we feed this hunger is wholesome. In my desperation, I have tried to fill the void with whatever lay at hand: political zeal, philosophical systems, carnal escapades, yet each time I only grew more malnourished. The noble yearning for faith and purpose in me has too often been corrupted into a tool for power, leaving me burnt and cynical. Every false sanctuary I enter eventually reveals itself as another throne of lies. Our culture trades in such lies as if they were salvation. False idols and platitudes masquerade as truth on every screen and street corner. We are told that fulfillment is just one more indulgence away, that every desire is sacred and every feeling true, and that pursuing pleasure at any expense is the path to freedom. I followed those lies for years, hoping they would lead me to a home for my soul. Instead, they led me here, to the edge of an endless carnival where nothing is real. As Hannah Arendt warned, a society like ours blurs the line between fact and fiction until the distinction between true and false no longer exists. I have felt this firsthand. Drowning in information but starved for wisdom, I could no longer discern reality from illusion. Each new ideology that beckoned with certainty eventually showed its fanatic heart. Each new pleasure that promised solace became another chain. I became one of the faithful betrayed. For in modern life all of us are faithful participants in systems of meaning that may be fundamentally betraying us. Whether we put our faith in God, in nation, or in the market, each is co-opted and sold back to us as a hollow product. I gave pieces of myself to these manufactured meanings, and each time I was left more fragmented than before. He recalls the fervor with which he once embraced various beliefs, only to be cast out from each like a heretic. Dissent and doubt made him an exile everywhere, in political movements that demanded absolute allegiance, in social scenes that prized image over intimacy, even in his own family's expectations. In every sphere, he found conditional love and ideology conflated with absolute truth. The moment he questioned, he was made unwelcome. Thus, he learned to stand at a distance from all earthly Edens, neither fully inside nor fully outside. This is spiritual homelessness, not belonging to any communal dream, yet not knowing how to dream alone. Still, a stubborn ember of hope glows within him, refusing to die. Though he roams a desert of desire in a world that has eroded spiritual frameworks, he senses there must be a true North Star somewhere above the smog. His soul thirsts for genuine transcendence, a way to reconnect with something sacred. But each time he reaches out, the promise of paradise proves hollow. The result is a bone-deep loneliness, as if even God has forgotten his name. And so he wanders the edges of Xanadu, neither sated by its pleasures nor guided by any higher light. He is in exile even within himself, haunted by the feeling that part of him is missing. Sometimes in rare moments of stillness, he faces an aching truth. Perhaps the exile is self-inflicted. Perhaps I have walled myself out of heaven. After all, I accepted the lies. I let my divine spark of love and creativity be twisted into a revolt against life. My innocent yearnings were corrupted, and in turning away from life, I fed the void inside me. Now that void threatens to consume me. Caught in this twilight of lusts and illusions, the flame of meaning dimly flickers within. I know the clock is ticking. If I cannot rekindle some genuine light, some purpose or faith, then I may join the generation that wanders eternally lost in Xanadu, a pleasure dome turned mausoleum for the soul. With that thought, a chill runs through him. He steps back from the neon glow, tears welling in his eyes. The great pleasure dome looms, indifferent, its laughter echoing into the starless night. He knows now that without a true home for his spirit, Xanadu's embrace can only smother. This false paradise may shine like heaven, but to the homeless soul it is nothing but a beautiful tomb. Chapter 11. Tears of Granite. Isolation, resentment, and the will to power. Morning light finds him alone in a silent apartment. Dust motes dance in the stale air as he sits at the edge of his unmade bed, staring at nothing. Isolation has become his daily routine, a habit etched as deeply as lines on stone. There are days he feels more statue than man, flesh turned to cold granite. He cannot remember the last time he was held, or the last genuine laughter he shared with a friend. In the beginning, the loneliness brought sorrow. He would weep quietly in the dark, mourning the world that had left him behind. But over the years his tears dried up, leaving only a heavy resentment that sits in his chest like a stone. Now when he tries to cry, nothing comes. Tears of granite, solid, unyielding. They cut his soul instead of cleansing it. He lives in a tomb of his own emotions, walled off from others. Yet inside that tomb, in the darkness of prolonged isolation, something toxic has been growing, an anger at the world that he struggles to contain. At times he nurtures this anger like a twisted companion. Feeling wronged and forsaken, he lets his mind indulge in blame. He blames the parents who hurt or neglected him, the peers who shunned him, the lovers who never were. He blames society for its shallow values and the systems of power that keep people like him small. In his more paranoid moments, he even blames hidden cabals pulling the strings of the world. Through late-night dives into conspiracy literature, he came to believe that much of what people call freedom is a sham. Even money itself is a grand illusion. He read, "Once upon a time, a secret cabal of bankers met on Jekyll Island and devised a creature that could create money out of nothing and charge interest on it." The facts stunned him. A private cartel granted the power to conjure currency and collect double interest on the same nothing. If even the dollars in our pockets are products of deceit, what hope is there for honesty or justice? Each new revelation hardens his cynicism further, another layer of stone encasing his heart. Alone with his thoughts, he lets himself fantasize that everyone is complicit in some lie. Everyone except him. This thought oddly soothes him. It justifies his solitude as righteous exile rather than misfortune. Yet the comfort of victimhood is short-lived. A voice inside whispers that he too has failed. In truth, his isolation is not only the world's doing, it is also chosen. Years of social rejection taught him to reject others first, to retreat before he can be hurt. Now he's stuck in a feedback loop of loneliness and loathing. The psychological toll is undeniable. He sees it in his mirror, sunken eyes, sallow skin, a tremor of anxiety at any unexpected sound. He finds himself hating the happiness of others, scrolling through social feeds only to sneer at the smiling faces and successes. It is a corrosive envy. He realizes with horror that he has become what he despised, a small soul nursing big hatreds. Friedrich Nietzsche once warned of this very metamorphosis, that those who feel powerless may poison themselves with resentment, a deep resentment that inverts their values and secretly longs for revenge. In his isolation, he has courted this poison. What began as genuine grievance at injustice has curdled into a bitter brew. He swings between feeling like a helpless victim and an invisible tyrant in his own mind, condemning all he surveys. This blurry tension between victimhood and hatred defines his inner life. When self-pity swells, he daydreams of grand apologies owed to him. When anger flares, he imagines dominating those who ever slighted him. It is a pendulum that never rests, leaving him exhausted and empty. He becomes aware that this resentment, as heavy as it is, also gives him a perverse sense of purpose. In the absence of love or joy, hate at least feels like energy. He has, in his darkest moments, clung to rage as a substitute for hope. If he cannot build, he will fantasize about burning it all down. If he cannot be loved, he wouldn't mind being feared. It is a shameful secret, but it surfaces in those late nights when the mind wanders unchecked. The culture around him seems to validate these extremes. Indeed, the system has taught an entire generation to seek significance through extremes. If you cannot be loved, be pitied, if you cannot create, destroy, if you cannot live with dignity, at least die infamously. He recognizes himself in these words. How often has he thought of making the world notice him through some dramatic gesture, however destructive or self-destructive, just to break the suffocating silence of his life? To his own alarm, he has contemplated violence in abstract, not out of genuine malice, but from an insane hope that infamy could fill the void where intimacy failed. The thought passes like a storm, leaving him shaken. He does not truly want to hurt anyone. He only wants the pain inside to mean something. In these grim reveries, he hears echoes of history's troubled souls. He remembers reading Dostoevsky and feeling an eerie kinship with the possessed youths and demons, those idealists whose emptiness made them easy prey for radical ideas. Like them, he has at times felt a demon of ideology tugging at him, whispering that salvation lies in fanaticism. The world's clashing creeds have often tempted him. One offered a brotherhood of the alienated, if only he would feed his anger into their cause. Another promised cosmic justice, if only he would renounce compassion and become an avenging sword. He stood at the threshold of these movements, and sensed how intoxicating it would be to surrender his lonely self to an all-consuming crusade. To let an idea take over entirely, to obey an iron logic so fully that his own nagging doubts and conscience would fall silent. What relief that seemed! It is the relief of the fanatic, the promise of absolute certainty in place of struggle. But he also knew that bargain for what it was, a Faustian exchange of freedom for false comfort. He would become a mere instrument, his mind haunted and colonized by dogma. In a way, it would be another form of exile from his own capacity to choose, as his will would be overtaken by the will of the ideology. Remembering this, he shudders and steps back from the brink. He chooses his forlorn independence over the seductive unity of the mob, at least for now. Still, the struggle within him is not over. Day by day, isolated in his apartment, he wrestles with the will to power that arises from his powerlessness. He recognizes this as a distorted will to power, not the healthy drive to create and overcome, but a vengeful urge sprung from wounded pride. It is the mindset of one who has been hurt and humiliated, now fantasizing about flipping the script. In his imagination, he is sometimes the triumphant conqueror, lording over those who once looked down on him. These fantasies give him momentary relief, a sense of control in a life that feels otherwise controlled by others. But they also deepen his alienation. The more he retreats into grandiose daydreams or bitter tirades, the less capable he becomes of actually reaching out to real people. His social muscles have atrophied, now only anger moves him. One gray afternoon, he looks around his tiny living room and sees evidence of how far his isolation has progressed. The curtains are drawn tight against the day. Stacks of books and printouts about conspiracy and philosophy lie scattered, mingling with empty energy. Drink cans. On the wall, he has tacked news clippings and scrawled notes like a detective mapping a sinister plot. Here a headline about financial corruption, there a printout about propaganda and narrative warfare, a battlefield of narratives where truth is only weaponized. Indeed, to him the world has become one giant battlefield of lies, and every day he silently rallies against it from behind his keyboard. He realizes that in his quest to uncover every deceit, he has lost the ability to trust anything. Every story carries a hidden agenda, every institution a hidden dagger, or so he believes. This worldview protects him from disappointment, but it also leaves him believing nothing is true. Without truth, where can meaning lodge? If every human endeavor is just a power play, if every value is just a mask for greed or domination, then perhaps his cynicism is justified, but it also means hope itself is naive. He sinks into his threadbare armchair, head heavy with this thought. The apartment seems to close in, the air too thick to breathe. In a rare soft whisper, he admits to himself that he is lonely. For all the self-righteous rage and conspiracy theories, for all the hardened cynicism that armors him, inside is a scared and isolated man longing for warmth. He thinks of the boy he once was, eager to find his place in the world, eager to love and be loved. That boy's tears were real and wet, they had not yet turned to stone. What would that younger self think if he saw the man he became, barricaded in solitude, worshipping anger like a false god? The thought stings. In this moment of clarity, he understands that his will to power is but a mask on his will to connect. All his resentments and dark fantasies are distorted cries for belonging and recognition. He weeps then. A single tear manages to escape, carving a path down a face frozen in a grimace. The tear falls onto his clenched fist, warm and wet, not granite after all. In that modest act of melting, he feels something shift. Perhaps isolation does not have to be forever. Perhaps resentment need not consume him entirely. The path out will not be easy. It might demand humility and forgiveness he isn't sure he has, but the mere idea of not being alone is enough to crack his hardened shell, if only a little. For the first time in ages, a ray of late-day sun slips through a gap in the curtains he didn't realize was there, illuminating the dust. He allows himself to hope that even the heaviest stones can be lifted, one tear at a time. Chapter 12. Mirrors of Pornography, Little Deaths, and the Echo of Self-Loathing. Night again. He sits hunched in the bluish glow of his computer screen, the only light in the room. On the monitor flicker images of bodies in ecstasy, faces and forms contorted in pleasure that is scripted yet enticing. His headphones drip with panting sounds and synthesized moans. This has become his nightly ritual, a digital liturgy of lust performed in solitude. In this makeshift sanctuary, he is both worshipper and sacrifice. The pornography he consumes is a mirror, reflecting back to him both his desires and his despair. He stares, unblinking, as scenes of intimacy play out without him. For a few minutes he can forget himself and dissolve into the fantasy. The people on the screen cannot reject him or judge him. They exist to fulfill an algorithm of arousal tailored to his cravings. Pornography has become algorithm-driven, a high priest that knows exactly how to keep him hooked. Each click is a small prayer to the god of pleasure, each orgasm an amen offered up in the glowing altar of his computer. Yet, as he partakes in this nocturnal communion, he senses a profound hollowness in the act. The moment the climax is over, the screen goes black, and there, faintly superimposed over the dying image, he sees his own face reflected, alone and ashamed. Almost immediately, the familiar echo of self-loathing begins. It usually starts in his gut, a sickly churn of regret. Why am I like this? He asks himself for the 1000th time. He fumbles to close the browser, as if shutting off the evidence of his habit can erase it from reality. But the darkness that follows only amplifies his thoughts. He feels dissociated, as though he left his body during the act and now has crashed back into it, heavier than before. The room seems to press in with judgment. He can almost hear silent accusations in the hum of his computer fan. Each night he promises himself this will be the last, and each time he breaks that promise, a little more trust in himself erodes. He knows the pattern well: arousal, indulgence, brief release, then a much longer tale of shame and emptiness. It's a cycle that binds him with invisible chains. As one analysis described, each orgasm a small death of meaning in this sacrilegious context. Indeed, as the rush fades, he feels something in him die a little. The French euphemism for orgasm is la petite mort, the little death, and here in the harsh afterglow of porn, that saying feels painfully literal. Each indulgence leaves his spirit a little more depleted, his sense of self a little more fragmented. What should have been a tender act of love has become a mechanical transaction, leaving hollow eyes staring back at him from the dark mirror of the screen. He was not always like this. In more innocent days he had yearned for real connection, the warmth of a lover's touch, the sacred intimacy of mutual vulnerability. But life dealt him rejections and betrayals that made him recoil from seeking love in the real world. Pornography became the safe alternative, always available and controllable, unlike flesh and blood people with their complexities. He remembers stumbling upon porn when he was barely a teenager, only 11 years old at most, curious and naive. The shock and thrill of that first exposure planted a seed he didn't understand. He kept going back, drawn like a moth to flame. That destructive seed was nurtured and grew into something destructive indeed. By the time he was an adult, this secret habit had wrapped itself around his heart. It offered an easy escape from loneliness and stress, but at a steep cost. Over years of compulsive consumption, he finds that his desires have been warped. The scripts of pornography have taught him to equate sex with spectacle, intimacy with domination, people with objects. He recalls a grim statistic he once read. An analysis of hundreds of popular porn films found nearly 88% depicted men assaulting women, a brutal choreography masquerading as desire. He had winced at that figure, yet night after night he continued feeding the very machine that normalized such images. By now he's viewed countless scenes that blur the line between pleasure and violence, consent and coercion, love and lust. What has all this done to his soul? He senses the answer in his inability to relate healthily to women he meets. An automatic objectification lens snaps into place, honed by years of voyeurism. The part of him that should see a whole person instead sees fragmented body parts and potential pornographic scenarios. It is a reflex he despises in himself, one that makes genuine emotional intimacy near impossible. Academic voices have long warned of this corrosion. He recalls reading that our hypersexualized media environment reduces eros to commodity, leaving even the promise of pleasure hollow. In his experience, this is true. The more he devoured these commodified sexual images, the less capable he became of feeling real pleasure or love. The high of the pornographic experience diminishes with time, requiring more extreme or novel content to elicit the same response, while the lows, the depressive aftermaths, only deepen. Social science corroborates what he lives. Constant sexual objectification damages young souls, breeding anxiety, deep shame, and low self-worth. What was touted by the world as freedom, the freedom to indulge any fantasy, has in practice begotten confusion and self-loathing. He is living proof of that paradox. The more he exercised this so-called freedom, the more enslaved he became to it, and the less he recognizes himself in the mirror. The fracturing of his identity is palpable. There is the secret self that lives for these nightly fixations, and the daylight self that carries on with work and basic social interactions, pretending to be normal. The two selves hardly speak to each other anymore. This inner division breeds a chronic sense of fraudulence and alienation, from others and from himself. In the stillness after his latest fall into temptation, he reflects on how pornography has numbed his spirit. Once, he could feel a pang of guilt that hinted at a moral compass, but repeated violations of his own boundaries have dulled those warnings. He worries that he is becoming spiritually numb, that even profound truths or beauties barely move him now. Where is the awe he used to feel at a sunset or a favorite song? These days, he finds more activation in a 5-minute explicit video clip than in the sight of the ocean or the comfort of a friend's voice. It is as though his libido has been hijacked by this devouring cult of images, leaving no energy for life elsewhere. Indeed, he muses darkly. Pornography and its surrounding culture form a kind of death cult of empty lust into which unsuspecting hearts, like his own younger self, were baptized. He sees now that in those moments when he offered up his most vulnerable desires to the pixelated altar, he was also offering up a piece of his soul. The sacred energy of sexuality, meant to bind us to love and to life, was converted into a pawn of the cult of pleasure. What should have connected him deeper to humanity instead isolated him further, turning him inward to fuel emptiness and self-destruction. The very instinct that could lead to creation of love, of family, of joy, has been twisted to serve oblivion. He feels this truth viscerally now, with each hollow heartbeat echoing in his empty room. And yet, even as he confronts these stark realizations, the lure of the next fix tugs at him. This is perhaps the cruelest aspect. The cycle is so hard to break. Knowing how it harms him hasn't been enough to immediately stop the craving when it strikes. There is a part of his brain, call it addiction, habit, or demon, that rationalizes and urges. Just one more time, you need this, it will make you feel better. Often he has obeyed that voice against his better judgment, only to find himself steeped in guilt and regret minutes later. It reminds him of a mythic paradox, like Tantalus reaching for fruit that always recedes. He seeks satisfaction that forever slips away. Each indulgence promised to free him from care and fear, yet demanded his surrender instead. He has become possessed by its will, losing a bit of his own willpower in exchange for fleeting release. The power dynamics are clear. He is enslaved to an algorithm, a slave to sin leading to death, in the words of an old critic. This bondage is not physical, but spiritual and psychological. Chains of habit coiled around his neurons. To break them would require a transformation at the core of his being, a kind of exorcism of the pornographic prophet that has enthroned itself in his psyche. He looks again at the black screen. In it, he sees not only his reflection but the faint outlines of countless others like him, a whole generation catechized by code, with lust as their lesson and orgasm as their amen. In this moment of raw clarity, he understands that his struggle is part of something much larger. The commodification of intimacy is a societal plague. It has stolen the sacred from sexuality and replaced it with a cheap simulacrum. The fragmentation of meaning affects not just him, but millions who were taught that pleasure is an end in itself. We were sold a lie, he thinks, that freedom means indulgence, that the self is just a brand to be optimized, that love is a game of consumption. Those idols of pleasure fed us nothing but emptiness. We now wander with nihilistic hunger, our hearts full yet starved. He does not want this fate anymore. A resolve hardens within him. He must seek a way out, a way to reclaim his sovereignty over his own desires. He recalls a striking idea he once read, that with awareness and intention, even orgasm can be a choice of path, submission to compulsion, or an affirmation of true love. The difference lies in awareness. Perhaps that is his road to redemption, to cultivate awareness, to refuse to live in the numb trance any longer. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, goes the old proverb, and in his case the knowledge is self-knowledge. If he can truly see what this habit is doing to him in the moment, perhaps he can break the spell. He knows it will not be easy, it may be the hardest thing he's ever done. But the alternative is to continue dying these little deaths until one day there is nothing left of him. That thought terrifies him more than the struggle for freedom. In the silence, he offers up a quiet, desperate prayer. To a God he isn't even sure is listening, or maybe just to the better part of himself, help me out of this grave I've dug. Give me strength to seek what's real. As if in answer, or perhaps coincidence, his phone buzzes on the table, a message from an old acquaintance checking in. He hasn't spoken to this person in ages. His first instinct is to ignore it, but tonight he doesn't. With trembling fingers he replies, simply, "Hi, it's been a while." In that small act of reaching back to human contact, the mirror in front of him cracks, just slightly. He is reminded that beyond the shadowy confines of his room, life still waits. There are still people who care, realities more fulfilling than the looping illusions on his screen. The journey ahead, to heal from alienation, to purge resentment, to find wholeness beyond addictive escape, will be long and arduous. He will likely stumble again, maybe many times. But, for the first time in as long as he can remember, he feels a faint pulse of hope. The flame of meaning, though dim, has not been extinguished after all. He resolves to tend that flame. As he powers down the computer, he catches his reflection one last time, tired, yes, and full of pain, but also determined. The echoes of self-loathing are still there, but quieter now, joined by a new voice that whispers of forgiveness and possibility. I am not beyond saving, he tells himself. In the darkness, that statement feels like the first truthful thing he has allowed himself to believe in ages. He steps away from the mirror of pornography and towards the faint light under his door, prepared at last to confront the night and seek the dawn beyond. A dichotomy of flames. Part V. Chapter 13. The Annihilator's Prayer. Crying for help while yearning to burn the world. I kneel in the darkness, hands clasped in a paroxysm of despair. My prayer is a contradictory flame, one moment a plea for my own annihilation, the next an imagining of the world in ashes. In this supplicant posture, tears of helplessness mix with visions of Holocaust, a wounded soul crying for help even as it hungers to burn everything. It is an internal war, waged on the scorched battlefield of trauma. The same pain that makes me beg for release also ignites a terrible rage for justice. In the deepest recess of my being, a voice screams, "If no one will save me, then let the world be cleansed in fire." This is the Annihilator's prayer, the black wish that my suffering either end or be made universal. They say that trauma splits the self. One fragment turns inward, sharpening into suicidal ideation, another turns outward, seething into world-hating wrath. I feel both blades at my throat. One part of me, heavy with despair, believes that only my own death can snuff out the pain. Another part, burning with injustice, fantasizes that if the world is the source of pain, then only the world's end can atone. Psychologists have long described this deathward pull. Sigmund Freud wrote of a thanatos, a death drive coiled alongside our life instinct. The psyche seeks to return to a prior inanimate state, as if the aim of life is death. In my darkest hours, that notion rings true. There is a part of the psyche that finds a morbid peace in the idea of ending oneself or ending everything. Yet even as Thanatos whispers seductively of oblivion, there remains the stubborn spark of eros, the will to live, to create, to seek justice. I sense it flicker in me, a sacred spark that longs to build, to reach toward truth, to grow. But trauma has corrupted that spark with vile images of both despair and revenge. I find that my eros, my life force, has been perverted. Instead of reaching outward in love, it turns inward, fueling only emptiness and thoughts of self-destruction. And when it does turn outward, it is not in creativity but in destruction. Love curdles into hate, creativity twists into violence. Thus, the divine spark of love and creativity is twisted into a revolt against life, and the innocent yearnings of the soul feed the void. How horrifically apt! My innocent yearning for rescue has mutated into a ravenous void, a void that demands to be filled with fire. In the silence of my room, my private Gethsemane, I realize that my prayer is not addressed to any merciful God. It is addressed to the void itself. Take me, I cry, or let me take the world. These words terrify me, even as they form in my mind. I was not always like this. Once, perhaps, I believed in the goodness of life, had faith in people or in God. Once I sought meaning in creation, not destruction. But injustice and betrayal have tutored me in cynicism. I have seen how the innocent are devoured, how the wicked thrive with impunity. The scales of justice never seemed to balance for me. The world's evil felt cosmic in scale, demanding a cosmic purge. In my personal anguish, I started to crave an apocalyptic justice, a final inferno to consume both myself and the cruelty of existence. I recognize, in a detached, clinical way, what this is: a trauma response. The abused child who cannot punish the abuser turns the knife on themselves, or fantasizes about burning down the abuser's house. I contain both that child and the arsonist he imagines. The first screams, "Let me die." The second snarls, "Let them all die." It's a gruesome duality, a dichotomy of flames licking at the pillars of my sanity. Each impulse is a mirror of the other, twin reflections in the black mirror of suffering. Suicidal ideation and world hatred might seem opposite, but in truth they share a common root: profound despair at the state of things, a belief that only through death or destruction can the agony be resolved. There is a morbid comfort in these extreme fantasies. To imagine no longer existing, to be free of consciousness beyond hurt, is seductively peaceful. Likewise, to imagine the world extinguished, all its cruelty and lies charred to nothing, carries a dark allure of ultimate justice. These are the two faces of Thanatos wearing halos of false mercy. One masquerades as self-deliverance, the other as righteous fury. And here I am, stuck between them, a single soul oscillating between self-immolation and universal conflagration. Somewhere in this inner war, I still search for meaning. I realize that even my fury at the world's injustice is, in a twisted way, a search for justice, a craving for meaning in the chaos. The hunger for meaning is a permanent feature of the human condition, the sages say, and it will always seek something to feed on. My hunger sought nourishment in noble ideals once, but not everything we feed this hunger is wholesome. When hope and constructive faith were dashed, I fed my yearning on the poison of resentment. I began to believe that if I could not heal the world or myself, perhaps I could purify it by fire. This is how a dark idealism takes shape, a death cult of one's own making. Indeed, I recognize in myself the same morbid tendency our culture at large has begun to glorify. As I teeter on the brink of personal apocalypse, I see reflections of my annihilatory urge in society's obsessions. Ours is an era fascinated by death and destruction. Even popular entertainment fetishizes the apocalypse. Psychologists and philosophers observe that a darker carnival marches just beneath the surface of modern culture, where sects and ideologues celebrate annihilation as a new ecstasy. There is talk of martyrdom and death. Cult ideologies that groom the disillusioned to welcome their own erasure and the collapse of others. How well I understand that twisted ecstasy now, the seductive idea of ending it all, under the guise of some higher cause or dramatic finale. We devour tales of global doom and cataclysmic rebirth, our collective imagination burning at both ends. It's as if, having lost faith in gradual goodness, we yearn for a final purging fire. I realize with a shiver that I am not alone in this temptation. My annihilator's prayer is but one note in a worldwide requiem. Yet even knowing this, I feel the pull. The scholar priests might warn that any ideology preaching annihilation is a death knell for the soul. But when your soul already feels half dead, What more is there to lose? The aim of life is death, Freud said. And right now that aphorism feels like simple truth. I choke on these thoughts, half in horror, half in relief. Horror at the monstrousness of my imaginings. Relief that at least they promise an end. In this volatile mental state, prayer itself becomes paradoxical. To whom or what am I praying? God? Devil? The cold stars? Perhaps I am praying to justice, a primordial need for balance in a world that feels unbearably skewed. I cry out for help, but in the same breath I volunteer to be the executioner of righteousness, even if it damns me. Heal me or let me burn them, I plead. It is frightening to admit how good the fantasy of burning them all can feel in the moment, how it soothes the feeling of powerlessness, how it masquerades as restoring control. But it's a false power, I know. It's the final deception of trauma, convincing the broken soul that salvation lies in destruction. As I end this silent prayer, spent and trembling, a thin line of reason resurfaces. I recall a time when I believed in redeeming the world, not destroying it. I remember that every fire once started consumes indiscriminately, the guilty and innocent alike, the world and the self, all together. If I lit the match, I too would burn in it. There is no purification, only obliteration. In seeking ultimate justice through annihilation, I would become indistinguishable from the injustice I hate. This thought arrives like a plea from a gentler voice within. Perhaps the last echo of conscience, or the vestige of hope. It asks, is there no other way? I have no answer tonight. My prayer hangs in the air, unanswered and dangerous. I remain on my knees, a living dichotomy of flames, half longing to be saved, half lusting to set the world on fire. In this state, I am as blind as Samson at the temple pillars, ready to make the whole structure collapse even if it kills me. And like Samson, I feel both righteous and utterly lost. Thus ends the Annihilator's prayer, a dark hymn from the abyss of trauma. In the coming chapters, this inner inferno will surge outward, intermingling with the grand, violent myths of history and society. For my private longing to burn the world does not exist in a vacuum, it is mirrored by ages of human myth and madness. If I am to understand the path I tread, I must confront those larger flames next. My personal apocalypse seeks kinship with the apocalypses of Babylon, Rome, and the modern age. Perhaps in understanding those, I might understand, or escape my own. Chapter 14. Babylon Reforged. War, Myth, and the Fantasy of Absolute Cleansing. There is an ancient dream that recurs in our darkest myths and our bloodiest history, the dream of purification by fire. When the world grows too corrupt, too fallen, we imagine flame will scourge it clean. This dream has raged from biblical prophets to modern ideologues, enticing generations with the fantasy of absolute cleansing, a final war or conflagration that will burn away all evil, leaving only purity or nothingness. In my own tortured prayer, I felt its allure. Now I see it on the grand stage of civilization, a pattern of Babylon reforged, as each era melts down the past in hopes of forging a utopia from the molten ruins. Babylon. In Judeo-Christian scripture, that name became shorthand for decadent empire and spiritual harlotry, a civilization so depraved that only total destruction could serve divine justice. Fallen. Fallen is Babylon the Great. Cries Revelation, as the archetypal city of sin is consumed in 1 hour by fire. Early Christians, persecuted by Rome, cast their oppressor as Babylon and foresaw its fiery demise as the birth pangs of a new heaven and earth. The book of Revelation paints a vivid tableau of this absolute cleansing, plagues and flames, a lake of fire consuming the beast and the false prophets, until finally the world is made anew. Whether taken as prophecy or allegory, the message seared itself into the human psyche. There comes a time when only apocalypse can purge the world of its evils. Rome. History gave us real flames to mirror the apocalyptic imagination. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, whether truly caused by Emperor Nero or not, became a symbol of destruction-feeding fantasy. Nero famously fiddled while Rome burned, the legend goes, allegedly envisioning a grand new city to rise from the ashes. Here was the purification myth twisted, fire as a tool of a tyrant's vanity, the city's suffering repackaged as an opportunity for rebirth on the tyrant's terms. Rome burned, and in the aftermath Nero did build his golden palace on cleared ground. Purification by fire, indeed. but the only thing purified was one man's hubris. Still, the idea persisted that flames could be cleansing. Later, when Rome itself fell to barbarians, Christian writers framed it as divine retribution on a crumbling pagan world, a necessary clearing of ground for a new Christian order. In war and sackings, they saw providence. The old must be burned so the new can be born. So too with endless other empires and revolutions. Paris, 1789, revolutionaries set aflame the symbols of the Ancien regime, convinced that from the terrors purifying bloodshed a republic of virtue would arise. Russia, 1917. The Bolsheviks sought to burn down not just a palace but an entire class system, wielding war and famine as instruments of cleansing society of bourgeois decay. Germany, 1930s, the Nazis torched books, synagogues, whole cities, all in service of an ethno-nationalist Reinigung cleansing that was nothing less than state-organized arson of peoples. Each of these believed, fanatically, in a tabula rasa, a cleansed slate. As one historical analysis notes, fascism in particular turned politics into a pseudo-religion of purity. The nation was personified as a supreme being that demanded devotion. Dissenters or minorities who didn't fit the national myth were cast as blasphemers against the sacred unity of the people and were persecuted with an almost holy wrath. In Nazi ideology, the Aryan was pure and good, and the Jew was demonic, an absolute moral dichotomy justifying genocide. Genocide in their eyes was not murder but purification. It was a war mythologized as a kind of sacred act, a fire to cleanse the world of impurity. This is the fantasy of absolute cleansing taken to its most horrific extreme and made reality. I stand in dreadful awe of how closely these grand atrocities echo the private nihilism I've tasted. The same impulse I felt in my annihilator's prayer, to destroy all that is rotten, even if it means destroying myself or the world, has again and again seduced whole societies. It wraps itself in myth to become palatable, a holy war, a final solution, a great revolution, an Armageddon. Always the promise is the same. Through total destruction, we will arrive at total purity. And always the result is heaps of corpses and a haunted humanity. Why is this myth so enduring? Partly because it offers a tidy narrative. If only we burn X the sinners, the class enemies, the corrupt institutions, we will be saved. It is absolute moral simplification. It feels like taking decisive action against ambiguity. A war that's more than war, a sacrament. We see this in how leaders frame their wars and purges. The language drips with the imagery of cleansing and rebirth. Consider the words of a fanatic: believe, obey, fight. The fascist creed turning political obedience into a religious duty. Or the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, who bragged they would start history at year zero after purifying the land of foreign influence and educated elites. Or the jihadist who believes an act of terror is a holy flame that will usher in God's kingdom. Different costumes, different flags, but the same archetypal drama: burn the world to save it. In mythic terms, it is the flood by fire. The biblical flood was water, but modern man, in his wrath and technology, chooses fire. Fire is quick, total, awe-inspiring. It creates a spectacle of judgment that our primal imagination associates with divinity. The mushroom cloud of the atomic bomb was described by witnesses in religious terms: a pillar of fire, a terrible judgment. Some who built it even justified its use as the only way to cleanse the world of the scourge of war itself. Indeed, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there were those who hoped the sheer horror would purify humanity of warlike tendencies, a hope dashed by the subsequent arms race. But even outside the context of literal war, the fantasy of cleansing fire persists in subtler forms. Today we have what some call culture wars, battles of ideology that envision apocalyptic showdowns. If not with guns, then with narratives. The notion of a final cleansing confrontation pervades propaganda. Extremist movements across the spectrum preach that only a revolutionary collapse or conflict can set things right. For some, it's a racial holy war. For others, a class uprising. For others, the collapse of a techno-feudal system. In each case, the present world is painted as Babylon, irredeemable except by its burning. Babylon is thus reforged in each generation's imagination, a symbol of the enemy's world to be destroyed so a righteous world can emerge. Modern forms of propaganda ingeniously stoke this myth. Through mass media and now digital algorithms, we see the crafting of techno-feudal mythologies. narratives controlled by a new priesthood of power that cast every struggle as existential, every opponent as evil incarnate. In effect, our information lords remint ancient myth in high-tech form. Consider a dystopian scenario sketched by one political writer, society divided rigidly into rulers and ruled, where the masses are kept docile with entertainments and lies, while an invisible elite wields total control. In this imagined New World Order, all of mankind is in a condition of high-tech feudalism, an outright techno-feudal regime. And what sustains it? Propaganda so absolute that reality itself is bent. The citizens are told that everything is fine. Hunger does not exist even as they starve. Housing shortages are solved even as they shiver in ruins. Because any truth that contradicts the holy narrative is illegal. This is a weaponization of myth to imprison the present. The ideology in power becomes the one true faith, and to question it is heresy punishable by exile or worse. In such an environment, real reform becomes impossible. Only a complete collapse seems capable of change. Thus even the oppressed can be subconsciously driven to yearn for apocalypse, having lost hope in gradual truth. When reality is nothing but competing fictions, and each power faction insists it alone holds the ultimate truth, society edges toward that battlefield of narratives where, as one philosopher put it, truth is not lost or found, only weaponized. In the ensuing chaos and cynicism, the idea of a final fiery settling of accounts, however disastrous, starts to seduce the weary soul. We see the seeds of this seduction everywhere. In online forums, in extremist propaganda, in some strains of environmental or political activism. The drumbeat sounds, something enormous and destructive must happen, or we are doomed. It is apocalypse as salvation. The techno-feudal age, with its overwhelming inequalities and invisible algorithms of control, breeds a deep frustration that can easily curdle into apocalyptic faith. People begin to believe in the burn, to worship the cleansing fire as the only honest God left. This is Babylon reforged, the deliberate myth-making that this world is so corrupt that only by war and fire can it be remade. It gives people a cause to cling to, a perverse hope that out of the ashes their longed-for justice will arise. But this is a deadly gambit. History shows that when we act out these myths, the result is not a purified utopia but collapse, of economies, of social order, of our very capacity for reason. The promised rebirth often never comes. All that's left is charred wreckage and a lesson written in blood. And yet, in the fever of ideology or despair, humans rarely heed those lessons. I think of those Nazi rallies with their Wagnerian pageantry and torchlit parades, a nation intoxicated on the myth of rebirth through conquest. I think of the young suicide bomber whispering a prayer before detonating, convinced he's a divine agent hastening the day of judgment. I think of propaganda ministers churning out lies until reality itself seems to melt, of internet avatars preaching civil war as though it were a cleansing rain. My God, I realize, we are so prone to this madness. The fantasy of absolute cleansing is psychologically seductive, because it absolves us of responsibility for the incremental, painful work of improvement. It is far easier to imagine one grand bonfire that ends all our problems than to face the slow, uncertain toil of reform and healing. As a trauma-stricken individual, I felt that temptation, all or nothing, eradicate pain by eradicating the self or the world. On the collective level, societies do the same. Eradicate injustice by eradicating the impure elements or the old order. It's an intoxicating shortcut, and a false one. What then breaks this spell? Perhaps only the recognition of its true cost. The survivors of real infernos, the wars and genocides, often emerge not cleansed but scarred and haunted. The purity they hoped for becomes a nightmarish guilt. After World War II, for instance, much of Europe stood in literal ruins, its people shattered by what had been done in the name of cleansing ideologies. The only purification that happened was a grim purging of illusions. The Nazi myth of a cleansed world died in Hitler's bunker. The fascist ideal of a spiritual revival through violence was buried in rubble and tribunals. But it took immeasurable suffering to reach that disillusionment. I ask myself, must we always learn by burning our hands or our world? Is there no way to douse the flame of the apocalypse myth before it engulfs us? Humility would help. A collective admission that no mortal crusade can create absolute purity or justice. In theological terms, perfection is not of this world. The fantasy of absolute cleansing is, at its core, a kind of idolatry. It makes an idol of our rage and calls it divine. And idols demand sacrifices, often of others, eventually of ourselves. History's bonfires have devoured their own makers time and again. A sobering warning comes to mind from a modern philosopher: the moment a political doctrine becomes untouchable and sacrosanct, it ceases to be rational and becomes an idol. And idol worship has a price. It demands sacrifices, often of others, eventually of oneself. In our context, the idol is this utopian fire that brooks no questioning. When an ideology or movement claims total truth and total solution, a final cleansing, it will sacrifice everything for that promise, including its own humanity. War becomes holy, opponents become infidels, and doubt itself is a sin. We saw it in the Inquisition's flames, in the guillotine's righteous blade, in the concentration camp's furnaces. Always the same pattern: absolute conviction, absolute destruction. As I stand amid these reflections, I feel the heat of those historic fires, and of my own inner fire. A realization dawns painful and clear: if I continue to worship my annihilator's fantasy, I am simply enacting a personal version of an age-old tragedy. I have cast the world as Babylon and appointed myself its would-be destroyer, but that mythic heroism is a lie. I would not be a savior, only another fanatic blinded by his own rage. Cleansing by fire is a seduction, not salvation. Yet I also know why the seduction remains strong. In a world where genuine justice seems elusive, where systems truly are corrupt and powerful cabals thrive, the urge to torch it all can feel honest. Even now, part of me snarls, but the cabals are real. The oppression is real. Indeed, we do see forces that resemble a merciless aristocracy, monetary and political scientists playing gods with currency and fate, reducing free citizens to serfs in a game of profit. The techno-feudal lords of our age hide behind institutions and algorithms, making a mockery of the idea of equality. They have turned many of us into unwitting peasants on digital plantations, our labor and data harvested to feed their towers of wealth. The temptation, then, is to believe only a great revolt or cataclysm can break those chains. The populist cry of our time, whether from the left or right, often echoes that sentiment: burn down the establishment, drain the swamp, reset the system by any means. I hear it outside, I hear it within myself. However, I must be brutally honest. History is littered with resets that merely rebooted old tyrannies in new guises. The French Revolution replaced a king with an emperor. The Russian Revolution replaced a czar with a general secretary. The faces changed, the gulags came. Babylon's name changed, but Babylon endured, sometimes in the very revolutionaries who thought they destroyed it. The fantasy of absolute cleansing doesn't eliminate Babylon, it reincarnates it, often within the victorious zealots. In striving to wipe out evil completely, we become vulnerable to evil's worst aspects in ourselves: cruelty, absolutism, hubris. It is as if the very act of claiming purity summons the demon of corruption, which slips in unseen because we are too busy scanning the horizon for enemies to notice the shadow growing in our own hearts. I look back to the ancient legends. After all the fires and floods, what remained? A promise, perhaps, that we should never again try to destroy all life the rainbow after Noah's flood. A whisper that ultimate judgment is God's alone, not man's to hasten. In secular terms, perhaps the wisdom is that imperfect life is better than holy annihilation. The task is not to remake the world in one grand inferno, but to labor humbly for incremental betterment, to hold our ideals with humility rather than fanaticism. As a writer put it, we face a choice: to recognize our ideologies as human constructs, fallible and evolving, or to fall prostrate before them as new gods. The latter path, the path of prostrating ourselves before the God of Apocalypse, beckons with certainty and passion, but it leads to the abyss where war becomes holy, opponents become infidels, and freedom of thought is extinguished by dogma. In contrast, if we can accept living in the tension of imperfection, to believe in causes but not lose ourselves in them, to seek truth but allow room for doubt, then we might avoid igniting yet another Babylonian conflagration. I end this chapter with a heavy heart, but a clearer mind. The fantasy of absolute cleansing is a flame that feeds on our deepest wounds and noblest longings alike. It is understandable, perhaps even inevitable at times of great corruption, but it is a false prophet. If I succumb to it, If we succumb to it, we become what we hate and we destroy what we love. The real challenge, then, is to find a path forward that does not require burning the world or ourselves to achieve justice. Perhaps that path is slow, unsatisfying to the impatient soul, but every other route leads to inferno. Babylon will fall one day, all empires do. But let it not be by our own blind zeal turning us into monsters. If there is to be a cleansing, let it be the cleansing of truth and reconciliation, not the radioactive glow of yet another failed purgation. This is a prayer I hazard now timidly, that I and we might be delivered from the temptation of holy fire. For I see now that behind the seeming inspiration of the cleansing flame often lies a terrible blindness. And to that blindness, the blindness of the visionary who cannot see the blood on his hands, we must now turn. Chapter 15, Divine Blindness, Acting Without Foresight Calling. It, inspiration. He stands at the edge of the abyss, eyes alight with a zeal he mistakes for vision. In his mind, he is a prophet or a poet on the brink of a masterpiece. Consequences are nothing to him now. He believes he is inspired by destiny, by God, by the pure conviction in his heart. To the outside world he appears mad, a danger. To himself he appears chosen. This is divine blindness, when one is so taken by an idea, a calling, an inspiration, that one becomes blind to foresight, to morality, to the human costs. It is the state in which they feel ecstatic certitude, a fierce clarity of purpose, never suspecting that this clarity is in fact a form of blindness. I shift now between first and third person, because I both am this character and observe him as if from above. Perhaps it's a final act of dissociation, or perhaps a last shred of wisdom trying to assert itself. The visionary, let us call him that, is ready to act. He might be the me who prays to annihilate the world, or a historical figure about to unleash catastrophe, or even an artist sacrificing everything for a dubious creation. In all cases, the pattern is the same. Under the intoxicating glow of what feels like divine or artistic inspiration, he leaps without looking. He calls it faith or genius. Others will call it folly or evil only after the fact. Recall Dostoevsky's Demons, that novel of ideology and madness. The youths in it were so possessed by their revolutionary idea that they surrendered their very selves to it. They speak in the tongues of absolutism, act under impulses not entirely their own, and are driven by a force beyond rational thought. They think it's enlightenment, but it's more like demonic possession. They no longer perceive right and wrong with a human heart. The ideology itself thinks and acts through them, writes one commentator, describing how fanatic fervor warps the soul. In that state, the self is eclipsed, the face of the fanatic becomes the face of the demon. They feel certain they are right, they feel holy, yet they have utterly lost their way. They are, in Dostoevsky's word, busy, demons, unaware that they are lost because their certainty blinds them. This phenomenon is not confined to 19th century Russian radicals. Hannah Arendt saw it in the real totalitarians of the 20th century. People so consumed by an ideology that they could commit atrocities with a clear conscience. She noted how under fanaticism, ordinary people became mentally enslaved by doctrine, their inner freedom extinguished. They were taught to love their chains, to embrace an all-encompassing explanation of the world that demanded absolute loyalty and left no room for conscience or doubt. What they felt as moral clarity was actually moral blindness, a refusal to see any truth outside the narrow dogma. When individuals surrender wholly to an iron logic of an idea, they forfeit their ability to think for themselves. They become instruments of a so-called higher will, their own moral agency disintegrated. Arendt calls it a haunted mind, a person who exiles their own capacity for choice, hosting the ideology as a reigning spirit. This is divine blindness at full intensity, when the light of one's guiding idea is so blinding that it casts all ethical shadows away. The fanatic, the zealot, the inspired visionary marches forward, eyes wide shut. They truly believe, often, that they are doing something glorious or necessary. The terrorist believes he is heralding a new dawn. The cult leader believes she alone sees the truth and leads her followers to salvation, even if off a literal or figurative cliff. The artist in a frenzy of creation might neglect family, health, basic compassion, convinced that his masterpiece justifies all. In each case, foresight is lost. They cannot or will not imagine the suffering to come, or they justify it as the cost of righteousness or genius. They certainly do not foresee the hollowness that often greets them at the end of their mission, when the divine light fades and they stand amid ashes and blood, wondering how it went so wrong. I feel this personally, standing on the threshold of what I once thought was divine inspiration, my annihilator's mission. A part of me was on the verge of acting on it, without foresight, calling it a bold leap of faith or heroic justice. I would have struck the match and believed it was God's will or my destiny. In that fevered state, I felt a perverse peace. As Dostoevsky described, ecstatic certitude coursed through me. The pain of doubt and fear subsided. I knew what to do. How dangerous that feeling is. It mimics the serenity of true inspiration, yet it is a counterfeit. It is the peace of the eye of a storm, deceptive and fleeting, surrounded by devastation. Our culture often romanticizes the figure of the mad visionary, the artist who cut off his ear for art, the prophet shunned in his time but later revered, the genius who defies all caution and changes the world. There is truth that great strides sometimes require bold leaps into the unknown. But there is also a line where boldness becomes blindness. The challenge is that from within the mind of the visionary, that line is invisible. How many tyrants started as idealists utterly convinced of their noble vision? How many disasters were unleashed by leaders who never suspected their clarity was blindness because no one could question their certainties? There is a moment in many of these stories, personal or historical, that in retrospect stands out, a warning ignored. Cassandra, in Greek myth, was given true prophetic sight, but cursed that no one would believe her. Many a modern Cassandra has tried to warn a leader drunk on his own inspiration, only to be dismissed or silenced. Before the fanatic commits the irreversible act, often some quiet voice or sign signals danger. But the divinely blind cannot or will not heed it. To them, any caution is cowardice, any dissent is treason, any alternative is impurity. Thus the train hurtles on, brakeless, towards the broken bridge. I recall a chilling observation from a survivor of Jonestown, where an American cult leader led over 900 people to a mass suicide murder. He said that the leader, Jim Jones, started as a charismatic idealist preaching racial equality and justice. But over time, Jones's paranoia and lust for control grew, and he moved the group to the jungle, isolated them, became convinced that the outside world was irredeemably evil and closing in. In the end, he and over 900 followers drank poison, some forced, in an act he framed as revolutionary suicide, a protest against the impure world. It was the ultimate purifying sacrifice in his mind. In recordings from that final night, as some followers weep or hesitate, Jones is eerily calm, assured that this is the right ending. He tells them not to fear, that this isn't suicide, it's a revolutionary act. That level of delusion, to call a fruit punch of cyanide an act of divine revolution, is perhaps an extreme case of divine blindness. But it started, as all such cases do, with the kernel of a beautiful idea, equality, community, that metastasized into a dogma no one could question. Jones literally spoke with a preacher's cadence. He assumed the mantle of the divine, and in doing so became a devil to his people. In literature and analysis, we find a consensus. The moment a person believes they have a direct hotline to truth or God's will, unmediated by fallible human reason or empathy, they are on dangerous ground. If I believe my every impulse is inspired, then by definition I will not second-guess myself. I will not stop. I will become unstoppable, and that is terrifying. We admire determination, but an unstoppable human is either a hero or a monster, and often it's hard to tell which until it's too late. One character from Dostoevsky's Demons muses that in pursuing unlimited freedom, he found unlimited despotism, a paradox reflecting how the pursuit of an ideal can invert into its opposite when unchecked. The revolutionary claimed to free everyone, but by making himself an instrument of a cause, he lost his own freedom and imposed tyranny. There is also the phenomenon of artistic blindness akin to this. Think of the countless stories of artists or scientists so obsessed with their vision that they disregard ethics or practical consequences. Victor Frankenstein in Mary Shelley's tale, driven to create life but blind to the havoc it will wreak. J. Robert Oppenheimer quoting the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," as he beheld the bomb his brilliance made possible. His inspiration in physics literally blinded him to the moral abyss until the mushroom cloud forced him to see. In both fiction and reality, inspiration unguided by foresight leads to creations that consume their creators. The divine gift of inspiration, if not tempered, flips into a curse. So how do we tell true inspiration from blind zeal? Perhaps humility is the gauge. A truly divine inspiration, if such exists, would not demand the sacrifice of one's humanity or reason. It would not fear questions, it would welcome them to strengthen the vision. The false inspiration, by contrast, tolerates no doubts. It forbids reflection. In my own near descent, I noticed I had stopped asking myself questions. I refused to contemplate what if I'm wrong, or what if this leads to innocent suffering. The absence of those questions was a red flag I nearly missed. It is said that genuine prophets in myth often resist their calling. Moses argues with God that he is not eloquent. Jonah runs from Nineveh's mission, whereas false prophets eagerly seize theirs and brook no hesitation. The element of doubt might ironically be a sign of legitimacy. If you are unwilling to doubt yourself, you are unworthy of certainty. Looking at our world, I see this dynamic everywhere. Leaders, activists, influencers, even regular people enthralled to social media echo chambers. How many have fallen into this pattern of surety unmoored from reality? It is as if the modern age, with all its chaotic complexity, drives some to find refuge in total conviction. The more uncertain everything feels, the more attractive and uncompromising doctrine becomes. And once they commit to it, a kind of tunnel vision sets in. Psychologically, they start filtering out dissonant information. They live in a self-confirming bubble. Soon, foresight and hindsight both die. There is only the mission. To outsiders, they seem reckless or fanatical. To themselves, they are heroes in a story that only they can see. We have seen these heroes in cults, in terrorist cells, but also in boardrooms and governments, anywhere the spell of infallibility takes hold. The phrase divine blindness also evokes a classic archetype, the blind seer. In mythology, like Tiresias in Greek lore, some prophets are physically blind but can see the truth. What I describe is the inversion, those who believe they spiritually see all, yet are blind to the tangible truth in front of them. It's a kind of selective sight, 2020's vision for the grand vision, total blindness for the here and now consequences. They might spout beautiful, soaring rhetoric. Some of history's worst tyrants were mesmerizing orators about destiny and renewal, but they cannot hear the screams of the people right beneath their podium or see the writing on the wall. This is the blindness that scares me now, because I felt it beginning in myself. I felt that cold, exhilarating clarity that would have made me capable of doing terrible things thinking them holy. In those moments, I was the extremist who performs atrocities with a clear conscience, having silenced the last echoes of empathy within. Empathy and doubt, I nearly cast off as weaknesses, ready to replace them with violent conviction. That line from the analysis of Dostoevsky haunts me. The possessed radicals no longer perceive right and wrong with a human heart. I ask myself, is my heart still human? Thankfully, the very act of asking that question suggests I've stepped back from the brink a little. A demon does not question whether it's a demon. A fanatic never pauses to test his moral pulse. I am pausing. I feel the weight of what I almost became. There's an image in the Gospels of Satan appearing as an angel of light. How profoundly true in psychological terms. The worst ideas often don divine raiment in our minds. My hatred showed itself as righteous, my despair as inevitable destiny. The angel of light promised me peace through destruction, inspiration without responsibility. I nearly fell for it. In this conclusion to my narrative, this final chapter of descent, I find that I am, paradoxically, ascending out of the deepest pit by admitting just how deep that pit was. Divine blindness, once recognized, begins to clear. Like a man waking from a hypnotic trance, I blink and start to see the outlines of reality again, the actual faces of people around me, not mere symbols of good or evil, the fragile beauty that still exists in the world I wanted to torch, the loved ones who would be devastated if I succumbed to either suicide or mass violence. These are simple truths that the inspired me had completely tuned out. A gentle thought arises. Inspiration is not infallible. Not every grand impulse is a commandment from God or the universe. Sometimes it's a composite of our pain, our ego, our longing wearing a pretty mask. True inspiration, I suspect, invites cooperation with others, engages with reality. It doesn't isolate us on a throne of certitude. Perhaps the divine, if it exists, values our foresight and compassion more than our capacity for dramatic sacrifice or destruction. If a voice in my head tells me to harm myself or others in service of some glorious ideal. Maybe that voice is not God at all, but rather the echo of my own unresolved torment. I reflect on a line from Corruption of the Faithful. Let us resist the corruption of the faithful. That slow erosion of openness and empathy that occurs when conviction curdles into fanaticism. My faith in justice had indeed curdled to fanaticism. My openness to life had eroded. To reclaim sight, I must reclaim humility and empathy, the ability to foresee consequences and to feel others' pain. Humility tells me I might be wrong, even in my strongest feelings. Empathy tells me that my actions, however justified I think they are, will affect real, feeling people. These two are the antidotes to divine blindness. They turn the one-way certainty into a two-way dialogue with the world, a check that says, look again, feel again. Are you sure? So I do look again. I envision, for instance, what would happen if I had gotten my wish to burn the world. It's not a clean cleansing. It's screaming children, blighted fields, agony and regret. It's the utter negation of all the goodness I purported to defend. Nothing just or holy about it, only tragedy. And if I had extinguished myself, I imagine the faces of those who might mourn, the unanswered questions I'd leave, the small potential for growth snuffed out. That too is not a righteous offering. It's simply sad. My suicidal urge dressed itself up as a noble sacrifice. I'll remove my burden from others, but behind that costume was the face of despair wanting to win. By envisioning these outcomes, I reintroduce foresight into my mind's equation. The spell of inspiration at any cost weakens. I see the likely endings of those paths, and they appall me now. This is good. It means I no longer fully romanticize the plunge. Perhaps I have lost a certain ecstatic feeling, that glow of absolute conviction. But in exchange I regain my sanity, my morality. The world regains a chance to not be harmed by my madness, and I regain a chance to find a different way to live. In philosophical terms, I accept that no human vision is complete. Every visionary needs a moderating friend, a sounding board, a reality check. Without it, every visionary is a possible tyrant or tragic hero in the making. In religious terms, only God or the universe has the full picture. Us acting as if we do is arrogance. As a line in Corruption of the Faithful noted, the moment a doctrine becomes untouchable, it becomes an idol. I hereby renounce the idol that my destructive inspiration had become. I will allow it to be questioned, even shattered. If it was true and good, it will withstand honest scrutiny. If not, it doesn't deserve my worship. In a sense, this entire narrative has been a descent, from anguish to rage, into ideological darkness, and now, at the end, a kind of ascent by learning from that descent. I do not claim a neat resolution. I'm not suddenly filled with light and joy, but I am at least seeing again, if dimly. And what I see is both heartbreaking and hopeful. A world still deeply flawed, still controlled in parts by vile systems and people, still full of suffering, but also a world where burning everything is not the answer, where my life, though marked by trauma, might still find meaning not in destruction but in creation or compassion. I imagine some readers of these chapters might have expected a full plunge into darkness as the only logical end. Indeed, I nearly provided that, a final chapter written perhaps as a manic manifesto from the brink of committing something terrible. But some merciful force, call it grace, call it the simply cumulative effect of reflection and cited wisdom, intervened. I cannot end without acknowledging the voices that guided me, the authors, the thinkers, the survivors whose insights I wove into these pages. They acted as my Cassandra and my Virgil, warning and guiding. When I quoted the faithful convert into fanatics, thinking they have found truth, but in truth they have traded their selves for a fantasy, I was really warning myself. Yes, I nearly traded my soul for a fantasy of righteous doom. Knowing that is perhaps my salvation. Because once you know your seemingly divine clarity is tainted by blindness, you can no longer charge ahead so easily. Doubt, in its constructive form, has returned. And so, I do not end as an annihilator, nor as a suicide. I end as something far more vulnerable, a confused, hurt human being who has glimpsed both extremes of hatred and found them wanting. Where to now? The narrative closes, but life continues. There is no tidy epilogue of redemption here, just a fragile commitment to step back from the ledge, to seek help and healing rather than martyrdom or murder. Perhaps that is the quiet anticlimax that true spiritual struggle often leads to. Not a blaze of glory or damnation, but the slow, stubborn work of living on. In closing, I recall the title of this part, A Dichotomy of Flames. It referred to the two fires in my heart, one of self-destruction, one of world destruction. Both flames have not been extinguished entirely, if I'm honest, but they have been recognized for what they are. They are not holy fires of inspiration. They are wildfires of despair and wrath, understandable in origin but dangerous if unleashed. My task now is to contain them, perhaps even to quench them with the waters of understanding. The world's great myths and tragedies have given me perspective. My own soul's cry has been heard in their chorus. If there is a final lesson, perhaps it is this: beware of the fire that claims to purify absolutely. Whether it burns in the world or in your mind, it will likely consume more than it saves. The true divine light, if such a thing exists, would illuminate without burning. It would guide, not blind. In our darkest nights, when we yearn to strike the match, may we remember that destruction is a false dawn, and may we seek instead the patience to endure, the courage to heal, and the wisdom to live with open eyes and an open heart, however much it hurts. I step back from the abyss, eyes stinging with tears but finally able to see. The end of the descent is the reclaiming of sight. In that humbled vision, perhaps, the slow ascent begins. Part 6. Chapter 16. Is there an elsewhere? Quantum dreams and the lure of alternate timelines. I sit with the heaviness of here, wondering if somewhere, somehow, there is an elsewhere. This isn't a simple fantasy of travel, it's a quantum dream of a parallel life unmarked by my trauma. In the quiet of midnight, I question whether the life I've known is but one branch of a cosmic tree. One timeline among many. If the multiverse exists in all its theoretical glory, then perhaps every choice I did not make, every life I did not live, still plays out beyond some invisible threshold. Contemporary physics even entertains such possibilities, higher dimensions and parallel universes lurking just out of view. Could it be true? If so, the allure is undeniable. A chance that, in another timeline, the wounds that define me might never have been inflicted, or that I became someone braver, kinder, more whole. In my darkest nights, I find myself yearning for that elsewhere. This yearning isn't merely personal escapism. It stems from a profound sense of spiritual exile in this world. I have witnessed what feels like systemic corruption of everything sacred. The institutions that once promised meaning have intertwined with power and profit until they're indistinguishable. What was once religion has been refashioned into ideology, a hollow creed breeding demons not from hell but from the very souls of the people. I have felt this corruption firsthand, faith wielded as a weapon, love reduced to a transaction, truth twisted into whatever sells. In such a world, I became an outsider. Daring to question the prevailing dogmas turned me into a heretic in the eyes of the new order. And where old theocracies might have exiled dissenters physically, the new secular faith silences them utterly. Heretics become invisible, erased from public life, stripped of voice. I learned that exile can be a state of soul, living among others yet beyond their pale, unseen and unheard. So I dream of parallel doors. I imagine that somewhere adjacent to this reality, another door opens into a room where the air doesn't choke with the fumes of our cultural bonfires. In that alternate timeline, maybe desire isn't commodified and sold back to us as a pale imitation of love. As Pope Benedict XVI warned, Eros, reduced to pure sex, has become a commodity. Man himself becomes a commodity. Maybe in that world, faith is genuine and not leveraged to control. Maybe hate isn't the fuel of every movement, and one's worth isn't measured by whom they oppose. Here in this timeline, it often feels like hate and outrage are the easiest sources of power. Indeed, mass movements can thrive without a god, but never without belief in a devil, an enemy to unify against. So that hatred and anger often become the primary fuel sustaining a movement's momentum. I have felt that fuel burning in my own veins. Righteous anger gave me energy when nothing else did. But it also started to consume me, isolating me in a bitter, vengeful loop. Small wonder I dream of escaping into a reality where that cycle never took hold of my spirit. My introspection often slips into allegory. I picture a traveler standing before a wall of parallel doors, each door a portal to a different life. Behind one door, I see a childhood, unmarred by violence, behind another, a world where my first love did not betray me. Behind yet another, a society that did not glorify profit over people, turning even freedom and faith into things to be bought and sold. The traveler, perhaps a version of me, has to choose, remain in the familiar world of pain, or step through a door into the unknown elsewhere. Is there an elsewhere? The question carries spiritual weight. In ancient scriptures and speculative metaphysics alike, we find hints of other realms. The Egyptian Book of the Dead spoke of going forth by day, the soul's journey to re-emerge in the daylight after death, implying that even death is a door to another form of life. The Tibetan sages likewise prepared for the in-between states of consciousness, teaching that if one navigates the bardo wisely, one may find either immediate enlightenment or a more auspicious rebirth. These teachings haunt me. They suggest that elsewhere might not be a physical parallel universe at all, but a state of being, perhaps reached through death, or through a kind of spiritual quantum leap in life. Yet, I do not truly wish for death. What I seek is a clean slate without paying the ultimate price. It's a reincarnative yearning, the desire to start over, to be reborn without dying, to hop timelines in the here and now. Sometimes I ask myself if this longing is just another seduction, another commodified fantasy sold by a world that preys on discontent. After all, entire industries thrive on our dissatisfaction with the present, dangling new identities, virtual realities, even transhumanist promises of uploading our minds elsewhere. I recall how the trauma of exile and persecution can culminate in a nearly messianic longing for a new homeland. In the same way, the traumas of my life have driven me to imagine a homeland of the soul, somewhere beyond this history. It's both comforting and perilous to indulge this imagination. Comforting, because it keeps hope alive that pain is not the only truth. Perilous, because it risks making me blind to the tasks and gifts of this reality. In the end, is there an elsewhere? Remains an open question. Quantum theory and mysticism alike offer hints that reality is not a single strand but a web of many possibilities. And so I linger at the threshold, one hand on a doorknob of a parallel door that may or may not open. The lure of alternate timelines calls to every part of me that feels trapped. But a gentle voice inside asks, if I found that door and stepped through, would I recognize myself on the other side? Or would I simply carry my unresolved sorrows into the next world? The lure is strong, yet a whisper of wisdom tells me that elsewhere might also be reached internally. Perhaps the alternate timeline I seek can be entered through the transformation of my own mind and spirit. With that cautious thought, I turn from fantasy to the next step, finding a way to leave this state of being without the finality of death, to undergo a personal exodus and yet remain alive. Chapter 17. Leaving without, dying, reimagining flight, surrender, and return. I have stood on literal and figurative ledges, gazing into the abyss, tempted by the oblivion that death promises. To leave this world outright, simply to not exist, can seem like the ultimate escape when the weight of life becomes unbearable. But what I seek is more complex, a departure that isn't an ending, a flight from suffering that might yet allow a return. Leaving without dying sounds like a paradox, but I believe it hints at a real spiritual experience. Mystics and shamans across cultures have spoken of it, journeys where the soul travels far from the body and comes back with new wisdom. There is an old Sufi adage, die before you die, which I take to mean a kind of voluntary ego death, a surrender of the old self, so that one can be reborn in this life. Could I undergo such a surrender? Could I give up the parts of me that are chained to pain and hate, and emerge renewed? In seeking answers, I turn to allegory and history. I recall the myth of Inanna, the ancient goddess who descended into the underworld, was stripped of all her garments, her symbols of power, and hung on a hook like a corpse. Yet, she returned to the living world, resurrected and wiser. Her journey was one of surrender. She let every adornment and title be taken, even accepted death, until she found the core of her being that could not be destroyed. Only then was she able to return. This myth has lived in my psyche for years, and only now do I grasp its parallel. I too might need to relinquish my clinging, to let parts of me die, in order to truly escape my inner hell and come back different. For me, flight first meant literal escape. As a younger person, I ran away from home, fleeing the sight of my deepest traumas. I thought if I put enough distance between me and the past, I could start over. Those physical journeys brought moments of relief, even wonder, but the shadows of trauma followed me. No matter how far I flew, I carried an invisible cage inside. It became clear that leaving had to happen at a deeper level. I needed the kind of flight one finds in meditation and prayer, the mind soaring beyond its habitual terrors, the spirit glimpsing a higher vista. In sacred traditions, we find guides for this inner exodus. The Egyptian funerary texts promised that by knowing the right spells for going forth by day, the soul could safely leave the darkness and re-enter the light after death. The Tibetan Book of the Dead likewise counsels the departing consciousness through eerie intermediate realms, aiming either for enlightenment or a favorable rebirth. Reading these, I realized they weren't just manuals for the deceased, but metaphors for the living. They hint that one can experience a form of death, a radical change of state, while alive, navigating the shadowy corridors of one's own psyche and coming out the other side transformed. So I sought a ritual of leaving that did not require my literal demise. For me, this took the shape of a deliberate surrender. I stopped running and turned to face my pain. This was terrifying. It felt like willingly walking into death's realm. All my life I had fought or fled, fueled by anger at the injustice of what happened to me. But fight and flight had both left me exhausted. In a moment of clarity, I chose surrender. Not surrender to evil, but surrender of my need to control the narrative of my suffering. I let the grief wash over me like a tide. I let the anger burn through its fuel. I collapsed from exhaustion, much like a performer at the end of a long, torturous play. There is a line in that earlier text about a carnival of empathy that ends in ashes. I felt like that, emotions spent, purpose gone. A hollow shell sitting in the silence after the long storm. And in that silence, something unexpected happened. I found a flicker of genuine peace. By dying to my rage and despair, I had made space for a new emotion, one I scarcely recognized at first. It was tenderness, a fragile compassion for myself, and even for the world that had hurt me. This surrender was my version of leaving without dying. I ventured inwardly to a place where the old me did die in a sense. In that inner underworld, I encountered all the terror and loneliness I had been running from. I didn't conquer it like a hero with a sword. I simply let it be, let it wash over me and learned its shape. Perhaps I even made peace with exile there. I met the exiled parts of myself, the child who had been betrayed, the youth who had been furious and self-destructive. I embraced those ghosts like long-lost friends. When I eventually returned from this psychological journey, I was carrying those once-banished parts of me back into life. Returning is as important as leaving. Many people get lost chasing transcendence. They leave and never find their way home. I nearly did. After my surrender, I felt so light and free of the world's concerns that I was tempted to withdraw forever, to live in solitary contemplation and never re-engage with messy humanity. But then I thought of the allegory of a bodhisattva, the enlightened being who, at the threshold of nirvana, chooses to return to the world to help others. I am far from enlightened, but I felt a responsibility to return from my inner voyage with whatever scraps of wisdom I'd gathered. If I had found a secret door out of despair, even for a moment, could I show others where to find it? My return has been gradual and cautious. I have reimagined what flight means, not a permanent escape, but a temporary journey to gain perspective. I've learned what it means to die and be reborn in spirit without physical death. Every day is an oscillation, small flights and returns. In moments of quiet prayer, meditation, deep thought, I take flight beyond ego and fear. In moments of action, work, relationship, compassion in the community, I return, bringing a slightly better self each time. It strikes me that this cycle is, in miniature, a kind of timeline hopping. I am no longer exactly the person I was before. A part of that self did die in the surrender, and a new self took its place. Thus I am living in an alternate timeline now, the timeline in which I did not succumb to hate or despair, the timeline in which I survived. Perhaps this is how we cheat fate. By allowing parts of us to pass away, we alter the story going forward. To leave without dying ultimately meant to change deeply without ending my life. It was a metamorphosis rather than an exit. And crucially, it has allowed a glimmer of hope to resurface. I find myself now like a traveler who has gone through a great storm at sea and come back to shore. I'm scarred, yes, and forever marked by what I experienced, but I wash up on the sand strangely hopeful. The sky ahead is uncertain, dawn merely hinted at, but I can imagine walking into whatever morning comes. Chapter 18. Towards an uncertain dawn. Can hate exhaust itself into hope? Dawn is on the horizon, but it is uncertain. After so long dwelling in darkness, after navigating corrupt systems, spiritual exile, and the seductive power of hate, I approach the idea of hope with caution. Can hate exhaust itself into hope? Can the raging fires of anger and resentment truly burn out and leave behind not just charred ruins, but fertile ashes from which something new can grow? I pose these questions to myself in a hushed, almost reverent tone. They carry echoes of an older question. Can evil be overcome by good, not through direct conflict but by a kind of inner alchemy? I begin by reflecting on my own journey. Hate was a fuel for me at one time. Its heat kept me alive when I felt cold and powerless. There was a perverse comfort in it. Hate toward those who hurt me. Hate toward the unjust world. Even hate toward myself for being weak. It gave me an identity and a purpose, to oppose, to resist, to fight. In the broader world, I see the same pattern. Entire communities and movements galvanized by what they stand against. As one commentator insightfully noted, mass movements can rise and spread without belief in God, but never without belief in a devil. An enemy is essential to unify the ranks. Hatred and anger often become the primary fuel sustaining a movement's momentum. We can see this in history's cycles of revolutions and backlashes, and we see it today in polarized politics and culture wars. Rallying people around hate works, for a time. But hate is an unsustainable fuel. It burns hot and bright, yet it consumes all the oxygen and leaves one lightheaded and spent. I have experienced how hate eventually hollows you out. After the adrenaline of righteous fury subsides, one is left with bitterness and fatigue. I think of the allegory of the carnival from earlier. After the wild frenzy, the grounds are strewn with confetti and ashes, the laughter faded. A few lonely figures remain. The air is heavy and still. Emotion spent, purpose gone. That image of confetti and ashes haunts me. It is the aftermath of hate's orgy. We often imagine that unleashing our rage will achieve something final, a catharsis or the destruction of whatever oppresses us. Some extreme ideologies even revel in the idea of burning everything down, believing from the ashes, their ideals will arise. It is a secular auto da fe, a purging fire as sacrament offered in hope of a new world. I understand that temptation well, the notion that if we burn it all, the institutions, our enemies, even our own former selves, we can start anew on the purified ground. But does hate ever truly yield hope in that straightforward way? History's answer leans toward no. Burning everything down often just leaves desolation. The new world that was supposed to rise from the ashes often fails to materialize, or when it does, it's built on the same cycle of vengeance. The French Revolution's terror led not to utopia but to the guillotine and eventually Napoleon's tyranny. Countless revolutions devoured themselves. Hate begets hate, violence begets violence. Yet, within that seemingly endless cycle, I note an intriguing pattern. Sometimes the very exhaustion of hate does become the turning point. When hate runs out of steam, when people are simply too tired to keep feeding the fire, a space opens up. In that space, something like hope can tentatively take root. It reminds me of a scorched field cooling in the dawn. Nothing is left standing, and in the stillness that follows, one can suddenly hear one's own heartbeat again. There is clarity. There is emptiness. An emptiness that, with careful nurturing, could become possibility. I do believe hate can burn itself out. I felt it happen in me. My hatred reached a fever pitch, and then one day I woke up utterly depleted. I had no more energy to hate. I was too tired. That could have led to despair, a total collapse. And indeed, for a while, I flirted with nihilism in that void. But precisely because hate had cleared everything away, I found myself confronted with a stark choice, either die in the emptiness or plant a seed in it. This is where hope crept back in, quietly, like a thief tiptoeing into an abandoned house. I realized I did not actually want to die. I realized that somewhere beneath all that anger I still cared about something pure, like love or beauty or truth, however tiny a spark of care it was. Nurturing that spark has been my task as I move toward this uncertain dawn. I have had to accept that hope, like trust, returns slowly. It is cautious, The new dawn is uncertain precisely because I know how easily the old darkness can return. But I also know that the darkness is not all-powerful. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it, goes the biblical verse, and I hold on to that promise. In practical terms, I take it to mean that if I and others live by our better lights, the night of hatred cannot last forever. The key is that we have to actively cultivate the opposites of hate, even as we recover from it. We must choose to value love over hatred, truth over comforting lies, community over raw consumption, contemplation over mindless stimulation. These are timeless truths we nearly forgot. We are rediscovering that love is more important than hate, truth more sustaining than lies, community richer than consumption, and contemplation more fulfilling than endless distraction. Such realizations are the gentle seedlings of a golden dawn in the making. Still, I call the dawn uncertain, because these seedlings are vulnerable. Just because hate has exhausted itself in one cycle doesn't mean it won't ignite again. Hope requires continual tending. I am mindful of how easily societies relapse, how a fearful event or charismatic demagogue can reignite the old flames. Yet, I hold a cautious optimism that over time, hatred truly can exhaust itself to a point of transformation. There is a natural limit to how much destruction living beings can endure. Eventually, people yearn to live. They hunger for meaning, for rebuilding, for peace. We see it after every devastating war or conflict. Eventually, enemies tire of blood and sit at a table to talk. Societies pick up the rubble and start planting gardens. It's not guaranteed. Many times hate leaves permanent scars or even total ruin, but the possibility of renewal is always there. As I conclude this journey in writing, I meditate on a final allegorical image, a burned forest at dawn. The great fire has swept through, leaving a blackened landscape. At first, it looks like absolute death, but give it time. Already the soil, enriched by ash, holds new seeds. And when the morning light hits, one can see tiny green shoots poking up through the char. Like a forest after a fire, we could see new growth nourished by ashes, reaching upward again towards the light. The ashes of hate, in this vision, become the fertilizer for hope. The transformation is not automatic. It requires that seeds of something better were there all along, waiting for their chance. In my life, those seeds were the faint memories of love and truth I'd experienced before the fall. In our world, those seeds are the enduring human values that no amount of cynicism can fully erase. Can hate exhaust itself into hope? I will answer in the only way I honestly can, yes, but not by itself. Hate will burn out on its own eventually, but hope blossoms only if we cultivate it. The ashes alone are not enough. What matters is what we choose to plant in them. I stand now at the threshold of an uncertain dawn, holding a handful of seeds. My small acts of kindness, my willingness to trust again, my commitment to truth-telling. The sky is bruised from the long night, and I do not know what weather the new day brings. But I step forward and plant those seeds in the ashen soil. It is a humble act of faith. The first rays of sun break over the horizon, illuminating the smoke that still lingers. This is how it begins, I tell myself. Hate has finally grown tired, and now it rests. In its resting, I dare to work, slowly, gently, coaxing life from the ruins. I do not expect miracles at once. All I expect is that, in time, green shoots will emerge. And perhaps one day, when I am long gone, a mighty oak of compassion or a cedar of wisdom will stand where once there was just scorched earth. That is the hope that guides me toward the light, however uncertain, of a new dawn.